analysis, and characterization. So what this means is that this is how we actually build the fundamentals of an argument, and how do we expand upon like our own thoughts of like what arguments are. So let me just make my screen full. Right. So I can't see the chat right now. So if you all have any questions, I will answer it at the end of the like each slide. I'll just have some breaks in between, and then we will be answering questions for each other. So yeah. So let me just do another let me just do another actually let me actually just open the chat on the side. Then that'll be easier for me to do some thought exercises with everyone. Okay, okay, so I think the biggest question that we all have is oftentimes like how do we build an argument? I think when we see a motion, it's very easy for us to see like, oh, what we want to argue, what we want to run. Like if it's a motion on banning smoking, we always have the thought in mind like, oh, there's something about health, there's something about the environment, there's something about addiction, there's something about the role of the government. So, because we are intellectually curious, we always have these thoughts. Importantly, in debating, the way we debate is by formalizing these thoughts, like being able to build an argument out of these thoughts. So arguments have to be three things at least. So let's just look at a motion on this house would ban smoking. So a THW means this house would. It just means that, oh, you would ban smoking. We'll go into detail on what motion types are tomorrow in the briefing as well. Um, so arguments have to be three things. The first is that they have to be relevant. So what this means is that you have to be the thing that you're arguing should be relevant to what you are debating about. So in an argument on smoking harms the health of people, cigarettes make other individuals think badly of you, it must be relevant to why you should ban smoking. So the biggest question after you look at a motion is always this motion, and what we're debating about is whether or not we should ban smoking. Not just smoking, not just banning, but banning smoking altogether. What this means is that you have to think in a way that like the government is doing something, and the debate then is about whether or not the government should do something like that. The second thing that you have to take note of is arguments have to be logical. What this means is that your arguments have to follow a certain type of flow, or your arguments have to follow a certain type of process in order to make that argument logical. So, like, you know how when you talk to your friends, sometimes people say, hey, you're talking like no logic, like, which is basically meaning that, like, you don't really make sense. You don't really sound like you know the thing, and you don't make it seem like it's true. So in arguments about like, oh, a ban on smoking will lead to people smoking illegally, you need to tell me why is it logical that because we ban smoking, how do people still smoke and how do people do it illegally? And you need to also explain to me why smoking illegally is a bad thing. The second argument on like a ban on smoking will probably lead to violent riots. There's also a gap in between. It's also asking the question, why does a ban on smoking would lead to a violent riot? Because there's a big like gap in link in between, right? Like you have to prove. And like today we'll cover on how we're making our arguments logical. The last thing we do is on arguments have to be persuasive. What this means is that sometimes arguments don't have to just be facts and numbers. You know how people sometimes argue, they say, oh, like people don't really like to pull up stuff like Oxford studies, people don't really like to pull up research papers, although research papers and like, certain logical arguments are persuasive. Most of the times debating involves being able to use the way we speak, use different narratives, or just be able to paint a strong imagery. So you know how your English teacher teaches you like certain literary devices in order to make yourself persuasive in writing? Debating is the art of being able to speak persuasively. So when you have arguments like you harming secondhand smokers and you harming the environment, what this means is that oftentimes you have to paint a certain picture into proving that harming secondhand smokers is a very big deal. Like, talking about the generational addiction, like generational problem of like addiction and explaining like how these individuals probably suffer because of smoking. When it comes to harming the environment, you can probably talk about how smoking is just a large part as to why climate change is still a persistent issue, and like how the extension of like, like the perpetuation of climate change is exactly what deteriorates like the survivability of human beings on this earth. So it's always using certain types of language to make it sound very urgent, to make it sound very persuasive. And these are what arguments have to be. Okay, right. Today we'll be looking at picking the right arguments. So knowing what is right in a debate and what are the right arguments is something that is very hard to be taught. Like I've been debating for 4 or 5 years. I also sometimes do not know what are the right arguments to run, like whether or not this is the right debate for me to run it. It's always by experience where you develop your debate intuition. So it's always through debating, it's always through constant practice and learning that you build what you call a debate sense, which is basically like if you look at a debate motion, you know how to read it, you know how to develop arguments. But today we can look at how we make arguments more persuasive by comparing the following five things. The following five things are very basic levels of like what we call weighing in debates, but in like just a basic sense, is basically explaining why, if you fulfill these five things, or if you use an argument and the argument fulfills one of these five things, it's a persuasive argument that you can probably follow through. So, sometimes like, the severity of the outcome, if your argument is arguing like something that's going to be very, very serious. Like if you don't do this, the entire fate of humanity is just in your hands. Like if it's like Thanos level threat, it's also about like the scope of the argument. If it's something that's big, if it's something that's global, like if this issue affects not only a group of people but affects a large majority of individuals, this is also a persuasive argument that you can probably like look at it that way. The urgency of the issue is that like you sometimes it's stuff like climate change, sometimes it's stuff like racial injustice or like racism, is that if you don't stop it right now, the process is gonna persist continuously and it's gonna get worse, or we don't even have time to see it get worse. So something like that. It's also your argument should also look at its effectiveness. Like if you want to argue something about if it's a motion about probably like social change, you can probably point out that certain arguments are not like you cannot oftentimes prove social change. Like nobody can prove that racism is going to be gone. Nobody can prove that gender inequality is going to just disappear in a very short term. So it's always thinking about whether or not your argument not only makes sense, but also just whether or not it's going to be effective in the short term or the long term in some way or another. And the last thing is also something that's very, very important that people oftentimes lose out on is in terms of moral necessity and relevancy. What this means is that when we do arguments, there's always a basic like argument like minimum that we should adhere to. Like all of the things above explain how big the issue is, but sometimes like things cannot be very big issues. If you want to talk about indigenous people in Malaysia and the lack of indigenous rights in Malaysia, even though they're listed as Bumi Putra, unfortunately, these are individuals who are a minority in the country, and it's very hard for them to like. It's very hard for normal arguments to fit in the level of severity, urgency, because people don't really care that much. The point is, we can draw certain types of significance to this using moral standards. What this means is that if the country of Malaysia respects human rights and respects the ability for individuals to have a good quality of living, then we should prioritize these individuals in these arguments. So the moral necessity and relevancy is used to tap into or to persuade the judge using moral minimums and moral standards. It's like if you want to follow this moral standard, you have to go with this argument like that. And these are things that oftentimes are very like minimal. So it's like the saving of human life, equality for almost everyone. It's also just in terms of like the ethics behind this, whether or not currently we are morally accepting of these things. So it's oftentimes how we build that gap into making our arguments persuasive. But today we can also learn about how to make our arguments logical. So how do we build an argument to make it logical to begin with? In terms of like the five things that I've told you at the start, these are things that we can probably think about it at the back of my mind. Like when we're thinking about arguing something, let's just use these five things. Do a like product check, like your teachers also oftentimes tell you to double check your essays. It's always like double checking whether or not you're doing the right thing and then going ahead with the right thing. Today we'll learn about how to make the argument at least make sense. Right. At this point in the workshop. Does anyone have any questions just yet that they'd like to answer? That they'd like to ask? Mm, okay, no worries. We will continue and then you can ask afterwards as well. No worries. All right. So here's how we analyze arguments. So when we say analyze arguments, we need to think about it like that. You know how when you write it's debating is really like just writing essay, but using your mouth to speak out the essay instead. And also you don't have enough time to write a full essay, but it's just basically like explaining how like it's basically making a very persuasive essay like through your speech. It's writing a speech. So similar to how essays have different types of formats in terms of like how do we build persuasive arguments like Oreo, like star. I don't know what your teachers use right now to abbreviate like how you build the argument, but analyzing an argument in debate has to be composed of the four things that you see right now. Um, it's basically a basic like format of how we build arguments, but the way we build it oftentimes is different and how we prioritize each thing is different as well. The first thing is what we call a premise or an assertion. So when it comes to a premise or assertion, is that you want to point out what the basis of this argument is. So if you have an argument about protecting national security and the debate is about allying with a big military country. The premise can be, oh, we want to secure national security, and national security is secured by partnering with this big military country. I don't know, like China, like the US, like India, etc. So the premise is basically like the main reason why you're arguing this argument, but you say it in like a very short part of it. So this is the point of me saying the argument. The point of me saying is that Malaysia is going to get protection because we ally with this certain country. And that's just it. So the second part to that is then proving the premise. Why is it true that we can actually benefit national security because we're allying with these countries? Here are the following reasons why. You can say like, this is a big country, they have a lot of military power. Point is that they are the only ones that are available to do it right now for us. It's basically explaining why is it true that why is our premise true? Like, why is the point of this saying argument something that is real? So you have to explain to me why this is real. The third thing is then is in terms of the outcome. So how is the premise important to the debate? Like, why is national security the biggest and the most important thing in debate? Well, we can say that there are existing imminent threats to our national security, like how other countries have been encroaching on our sea borders, or like other countries have been not respecting our sovereignty in certain islands. So it's basically pointing out why is it that because we prove that national. So then it's the next part. So after we prove that national security is something that we want to do, and we prove that national security is something that we can get on our side, then our side has to show why national security is the most important thing in the debate that wins us the debate. Yep. Oh, sorry. And the last part to this is just basically concluding the argument in a way that relates back to the motion. So this is we can just normally like wrap the argument up. It's just in terms of like, okay, so what, and once again, at the end of this debate, like the reason why we should prioritize to them is because national security is the most important thing in the debate. You can obviously point out like, oh, they're the only ones that can do this. So that's why we should partner with them and ally with them to a greater degree, or explain why, only because we are closer to them when we can get national security protection on our side. So both the thought process and outcome should include examples and characterization. We'll talk about what examples and characterizations are, but just basic level examples are basically using real life examples, probably talk about like what you know as like specific knowledge in certain things. Characterization is describing things that make it persuasive. So you cannot just say stuff. You also need to say it in a way that's more persuasive. So explain in detail in terms of like how we're supposed to do this. Okay, let's just do an example. On the emotion, this house would abolish the death penalty. We have three things that we need to do right now. The first is the premise, the second is the thought process, and the last is the outcome. Here's just a very basic level of like how we build an argument. Obviously, you should add more in your arguments if you have a lot more, and just make sure that you can fit it into 8 minutes. Oftentimes, we have two arguments for first speaker in 8 minutes. So if that's okay with you, like that's something that you're also aiming for, you should also just make it sure, like, we have all of them. Okay. Three parts. The first is on what are you trying to prove in the premise. So you can just point out the death penalty is inhumane and should not be condoned by the state. It's very clear. as you can see, the direction of this argument is focusing on the moral necessity of it. Because inhumane and like unfairness or like something that's cruel, like these are things that people don't that they don't mean much right now if we just look at the facts and we look at just like numbers and all that. But it's important when we look at the morality of people. Like if we sympathize with certain people who are of cruelty, why should we sympathize with the individuals who are going to be sent by the death penalty? Something like that. The second part to this is then proving why is it true that the death penalty is inhumane. Two parts that we can have. The first is just death is the worst thing to do against a human being because it takes away the universal right to life. A universal right to life basically explains that everyone should have a right to live. Like nobody should be taken away their right to live, regardless of what they do, because that's the basis. So the premise to that is also like, oh, you shouldn't do that, is because this is the only way you can achieve other rights. So only because you're alive, then you can get all the other types of human rights. And the right to be able to enjoy, the right to speech, the right to assembly, the right to shelter, the right to food. Like being able to live gives you the right to everything else. So what this means is that taking away your right to live is taking away everything that you can have in status quo in what you have right now, which is a very, very cruel and a very, very inhumane thing to do because it's the worst thing you can do against a human being. So something like that. So just being able to like persuade people as to like why a universal right to also is something that, is true. Second thing is also like how methods of death are painful. They can be severely botched. So what this means is that they can be quite, done very badly. Electrocution burns their flesh while they're alive. Hanging can leave people struggling until they're choked to death. Oftentimes, these are processes of hours. Lethal injection can destroy the nervous system that leaves them in excruciating pain until the point of death. Right. So, can anyone answer to me, like, what's the point of saying why methods of death are painful and why are we? So, can someone tell me, like, how does this second part use example and characterization to make the argument and make the thought process persuasive? Can anyone answer that for me? Any right answer? Like, there's no wrong or right answers. I just want to hear, like, what y'all think about this. So, how does this part use examples and characterizations to make their thought process persuasive? Does anyone have an answer for that? No, no one? No one wants to try? Does anyone want to?
It's cruel.
Yeah, cruel. Okay, that's nice. Oh, I see someone in the chat to show that to show its inhumanity. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Okay, we are on the right track. I think why I'm asking you from this is also, oh, okay, we have someone else who wants to answer. You can just text or like you can just unmute and tell us. Kavish. Yeah.
It's to show that humans deserve human rights and it's inhumane to kill someone.
Okay, yeah. So I think we know what the point of doing this is, but the point of me asking y'all is to look beyond that also. So when I'm asking y'all like, oh, why are we using examples and characterization to its inhumanity? The point is that this is what explains and this is what amplifies the issue. But also, this also explains like why like it's also asking when we come to moral arguments like these, the best thing that we can do is continuously ask the other side questions. But answering it ourselves, like, obviously we don't want to leave the open-ended question. So more like if this is the case, why is it fair that the role of the government is like, why is it fair that the role of the government is to execute these individuals by these means? Like, if these are things that what individuals have to go through, why is it justified for the state to do so? We say it's not justified. We tell you that these are things that nobody should go through regardless of what they've done, and the state should not be exempt from that. So it's always using what you have right now to just kind of tie it up. The point of me saying all of these examples is not just to show you the inhumanity, but also show you how big of an issue it is and show you how likely that individuals have to suffer when going through the death penalty and why is it unjustified. Last thing then is in terms of why the premise is important. So this is where we kind of like wrap up the argument. The government is the moral guide to society. Their actions signal to society what is acceptable and non-acceptable behavior. So we all know this. Like the reason why we believe that an eye for an eye right now is something that is important is because the government says it's fine for you to kill individuals so long as they fit under the criteria of the death penalty. To actively kill someone justifies the murder of people and validates society's bloodthirsty tendencies. Like the government should not be the body that also kind of like just agrees with the people that we should kill someone for revenge, we should be out for someone for revenge and make sure they don't have a life as well. Like the government should not be able to do this insofar as the government is what guides individuals to a moral pathway, and that's how we achieve that moral pathway. Okay, does anyone have any questions in terms of like how we analyze this? Okay, none. Amazing. Let's move up. Okay, let's move on to the next part. All right. There are oftentimes two very big mistakes when it comes to building an argument. So as you know, like again, let's recap. The um structure of an argument is premise, thought process, outcome, premise, process, outcome, premise, process, outcome. Remember these three parts. In proving a premise, you need to prove the link between the premise and the process. After you prove the link between the process and the outcome, after you prove the link between the premise and the process, you have to prove the premise in the process and the outcome. What this means is that imagine there are three different machines and you have to connect them together using certain other types of machines. The other type of machines are your links, which is proving each part as like something that works. So after setting up the premise, prove why the process is there. Then, after you set up the premise to the process, explain why the process to the outcome is also the same thing. There are two common mistakes that we oftentimes see when people do. The first is just focusing too much on the harms and benefits within the outcome without extensive analysis on how these harms and benefits will materialize within the process. Without the linkages analyzed in the process, a premise will remain only a premise at the end of the argument. What this means is that if you tell me something that is a premise, you can't just say, oh, smoking is harmful for people. People will die. People are not able to control themselves, and that's why the government should ban. The harm to this is that people are dying and people are addicted, and there's no way that like other way for us to solve it. Like you see how unpersuasive it is that if you just tell me smoking harms people without explaining to me the way it harms individuals, but also explain in a way that how like smoking harms individuals exclusively like harms individuals to such a great extent that a government has to ban something like that. So it's always proving to me. So importantly, we have to explain why these things will happen. And like I think that's the biggest question that we always have. Why will this happen? Why is this true? So again, let's just look at something like this. The premise is that people will be angered by this policy and there'll be backlash. This is probably an argument about, backlash against government policy. Again, the outcome is that therefore it will result in riots, regress social change, society is probably going to get more unstable. That's a fair outcome. I think like if we can prove that people are angered by policy and backlash, we can show that riots will exist. Point is, we need to show why these riots will happen. So here's how we build it. Probably you can point out the reason why there's anger on the first place. It's that the policy was passed without gauging the wider consent of the public will be seen as a blatant disregard of the responsibilities of the state. Like the public sees the state as someone who is irresponsible. Like they just do policies without asking what the people think. This will grant legitimacy for them to find ways to show their anger or show their dissent to the state. Like show why the hell should I care about you? Like why should I be someone who takes orders from you because you don't act responsibly like this and you're like creating policies that we don't like. Since most members of society disagree with the policy, they're able to validate each other's sentiments and give traction to the kind of social anger that they collectively feel. Humans are probably working in a society very, very often. If a lot of people agree with what you think, you are brave enough to explain to tell me like these are things that you also are angry about. So if everyone is angry about the same things, everyone validates each other into being able to exploit that level of like, oh, I hate this so much, like I don't like this at all. And like that's how people are collectively feel. And on a larger scale, we experience a spectrum of reactions. Like, so obviously, there are some people who are more sensible, who will approach the state, like with democratic means. Like, these are fine. Like, people are still going to call their MPs to ask why. But these sentiments might, at best, result in suppressed hostility or resentment, or at worst, find a less civil outlet, such as riots, or gain immediate reaction from the state. What this means is that we cannot just look at the best possible outcome. The worst possible outcome in this is oftentimes the biggest, people just rioting extremely violently. But the best case also is quite bad. Like even if we buy it, like, oh, sensible people will go to the government, oftentimes people are repressed and suppressed by the government, and there's a greater resentment towards the government after feeling like they're not being heard. So after individuals actually go to the state and say, like, you cannot do this, the government says, no, we'll still do this, people are obviously going to be even more mad and riled up. So that's how we create the level of like backlash and how we create the level of riots or regressing social change. So here's how we improve this. It's always asking the same question, like why, how, like why, how. These two things we always have to ask ourselves. Like, why is it that people are mad? Why is it that there's going to be backlash? How does the backlash translate to riots? It's always asking ourselves these things, taking baby steps and like 1, 2 steps, like explaining how one leads to the other is how we build an argument basically like that. And this is how we build the causal linkage analysis. Okay, another mistake is that stating a harm of benefit without explaining how the harm of benefit is something a harm of benefit and outcome. This oftentimes occurs in rights analysis. So like if you argue stuff like, oh, this is a human right, you should, prioritize this. You don't explain to me like, why a human right is a human right. You don't explain to me why a benefit is a benefit. I can't credit that as a benefit as a judge. So oftentimes we have to do that extra step to explain to me why it's important. So arguments presumably don't make an impact in a debate until you explain its actual impact. So what this means is that when someone listens to you debate, they cannot assume that what you're arguing is something that is going to be important. Like, uh, nobody's that important. So like you have to prove to me why you're important like that. And to prove to me why you're saying makes sense, what you're saying is something that I should care about in a debate. To do this, you have to either explain the importance of breaching a particular right or explain the consequential harms or benefit of your premise. What this means is that you should either prove why is it important for us to not um you know like why it's important for us to care about this right. Like the reason is that if after you don't like you breach a right means that you don't fulfill the right, or like, you don't let people have that right, there's going to be bad consequences to this. Or like explaining consequential harms or benefits of your premise is basically saying that after like the reason these are important is because these are things that happen because of the premise in the debate. It sounds vague right now. Let's just move into how it is. Okay, basic causal linkages missing in arguments. The premise is like workers are happy in their working environment. Process, it will increase productivity, etc., etc., etc. That's a good thing. Again, here's where the causal linkage is. How do we prove the outcome? Productivity is crucial to the development of the economy as increased output with the same amount of human resources increases cost efficiency. So much words, right? It just basically says that productivity is important because the development of the economy is increased, but also at the same time, the same amount of human beings working will allow for more resources and more things being developed. If someone is happy, in 1 hour, they can probably be more productive. They can produce like 20 goods in their factory compared to someone who can only produce five. Just based like if you study economics in like high school or SPM, you know that. But also at the same time, you don't have to know that. It's just that happy people, like you oftentimes don't just say, oh, this is economics. It's just basic knowledge, like basic logic. It's like, oh, productivity is important because people are happy. After people are happy, they are likely going to be more efficient and more productive. Being more efficient and more productive means that you produce more goods, you generate more social outcomes, your job makes more sense, and that's how you develop the economy as in a general. Then let's explain why efficiency is important. Efficiency enables corporations to reduce production costs and ultimately prices to their goods and services. Fair. If a company can produce more stuff, they're likely going to reduce the stuff so that people will want to buy them. This makes them more competitive within the market and able to increase net profit. But this also allows corporations to better working conditions and employee welfare, which will ultimately also improve the working and environment. This creates healthy and sustainable cycles of maintaining optimum productivity. What this means is that if a company knows that their workers being productive mean that they're able to earn more profit, they also want to make sure that the working conditions of their workers are going to be better, which improves the workers' working environment as well, which benefits the workers at the end of the day. So that means to say, if a worker produces more and is more efficient, they are also rewarded with better working standards and better working environments by the company. So basically, this is just how we prove like why productivity is something that's a good thing and why productivity is something that we should prioritize. All right. Okay. Now that's just the end of how we analyze arguments. So I just want to like point out the three things that we have to take away from this. The first is why is the premise towards why is the basis of building an argument? Can someone tell me what's the basis of building an argument? Like, what's the three main things that we have to do?
Uh,
Type in the chat, type in the chat. If you know, just type in the chat, unmute and say it out loud. Yeah, I see someone unmuting, you can just say it out loud. Okay. Okay. Anyone else?
premise,
Does anyone have a recap? Hmm?
premise,
Hmm?
process, and outcome.
Okay. Okay, that's nice. Anyone else? Okay. Okay. Premise, impact. Ah, again, those are premise, impact, comparative. Those are just like words, like sometimes they don't mean that much. Like premise, process, outcome. Yeah, I agree. Okay, for the person who answered premise, impact, comparative, can someone tell me what's an impact and what's a comparative? Like you should text it out, you should type it out. Steve, since you mentioned it, do you want to like tell it to you want to tell it to everyone? You want to say it out? You want to type it out what it means? Hey, it's okay. We can just let them have one. But anyways, if someone's confused about what impact and comparative is, it's just basically like the next level of like how we build an argument. It's like impacting is basically what we just said, outcome. Like why is the outcome important? This is not a unique part of your argument, but it is a part of your argument, explaining why the outcome is important and why the outcome is something that wins you the debate. A comparative is just basically comparing your side, comparing the others. It's like, why this argument? Oh, this argument directly goes against what they're saying. Like these are arguments that we fight against them. What they're gonna say doesn't match up to what we're gonna say. It's basically making an argument and comparing it to other people. That's just it. Um, Right. Okay. So I'm not sure if we have time right now to do these exercises, but please take a screenshot of this. This is the first. The one thing that I want you all to take away from this is that these are three motions that you can start preparing tonight or today with your team. Be able to look at, try to analyze the arguments, try to prove these things, and just look through it and see whether or not it fulfills the three things that you have. And then just like ask questions to yourself how you can improve on this and how you can make the argument better. So it's always about just looking at it, see how you can make it better. Looking at it, see how you can make it better, and just see how what part of it is still lacking and what you can work on. But these are three motions and these are three premises that you can start working on. Will give you just like the idea of like how it is, and then you can just like expand beyond that. So yeah, these are three things. Just take a screenshot of it before we move. Okay, but okay. Let me just go back just in case. Okay, I'm assuming everyone's okay. All right, that's amazing. It's amazing. It's amazing. Okay. Last thing is character. This is the last part of the lecture, and I'll move on to the next one with our next trainer. Um, but let me just see. Yep, characterizations. And what are characterizations? So we talked about a lot just now about examples, like how we use things to make these things persuasive. Characterizations are what makes it persuasive. Characterizations are detailed descriptions as to how the subject matter of the motion operates. These characterizations heavily impact the principles and consequences of the debate as it makes one scenario more likely than the other. So many words, right? It's basically just saying like the things you have to define certain things. Like some things you don't have to define, like smoking. You don't have to define what smoking is, but like you have to define like why do people smoke? You have to define like in what context do people smoke? Like where do they smoke? You also have to ask the questions of like why do so many people smoke? These are all detailed descriptions about what it is. So a lot of it is similar to storytelling, You want to tell your friends how your holiday in a different country went. You want to tell them how fun you had. And you want to make them like, oh my God, I love this person so much because this person has such a good life and such a wonderful experience. They want you to storytell. Debaters, you have to present to the judge a compelling narrative of events and the people and allow the judge to create a persuasive picture in their mind of what is happening or will happen. What this means is that when someone is judging the debate, they expect to have a picture in their mind. You are the artist and you have to paint that picture in their mind to explain how these things will work. Such as, if you're characterizing a group of people, we need to know what motivates them, what they desire, what capabilities they have or lack, how they relate to other stakeholders in order to believe that they will react in a particular way. This is just explaining like, we want to describe certain people, like, smokers. We need to explain like what do smokers desire? Why do people smoke? What do they have or lack in relation to other stakeholders? Like, do they have self-control? Are they addicted? So, and you need to explain these things into telling me why someone will react in a particular way, because no one is the same. But you have to explain to me why, in a general sense, most of these people are like quite similar, and this is how they will react in this certain way, and explain to me why. Yeah. Okay, characterization usually takes place in four subsets. First, the subject matter of the motion. Secondly, the problem of the debate or the trend or phenomenon in the debate is premised upon. Thirdly, the context of the debate. Lastly, the main affected stakeholder within the debate. So, depending on what the debate is, one or all of these subsets might require extensive characterizations from both teams. So again, you don't have to do everything very, very detailedly because you only have 8 minutes for one speaker and you only have three speeches. So there's not a lot of time. So it's always about explaining why certain things are more important than the others, and it's using your debate sense to point out like what are things that you have to focus more on and what are things that you have to prioritize a lot more on. Such as on the matter of this house would legalize prostitution. Again, so the subject matter is prostitution. I think you need to explain to me what prostitution is. Like you need to tell because I think there are a lot of things like how people do it. It's like, prostitution just again is like paying money to have like, sexual favors. But what does it also include? Like, is it just like certain people? Is it just something casual? What do people do about it? The problem is that it's an unregulated industry. What this means is that by making it illegal, the government cannot regulate it. The government has to only crack down and ban on it. So what this means is that there's no protection, there's no people, there's like people who work in prostitution cannot get their protection. If someone just decides to like, receive the favors and not pay for the money, they are also just people who are not going to be able to get the money back, something like that. What are the contexts? Like, where does this happen? Like, is it happening in developed or developing countries? What communities are within that society? And lastly, it's just the stakeholders, like, your prostitutes, like your individuals who work in the sex industry. Like, these are things that we have to characterize. Like, explain what the issue is, explain who they are. So again, I think the biggest clarifying thing is that like characterization is different from definition. We shouldn't just explain to me the definition of what a prostitution industry is. I don't need that. I want you to paint me a picture of like how it is like and how do people how are people interacting within that industry. Something like that. It's going beyond just defining certain words, but being able to point out why these certain words are important in explaining and painting the bigger picture. Once again, we are the artists, we're trying to paint a picture. These are things that we have to paint within our picture. Okay, again, let's talk about the first part, stakeholder characterization. Stakeholder refers to the group of people or category of interest that are affected by the debate motion. Most debates zero in on a specific stakeholder which will be deemed as the most important within the debate. Let's look at this. This house would ban the hijab. The biggest thing is probably the religious community. If you want to go deeper into that, you can probably talk about individuals who are within that community, like women within the religious community. Like the debate is specifically about how women are going to be different in society right now and whether or not it's a good or a bad thing for women. Here are a few factors you can consider when characterizing stakeholders. You can probably explain the motivations of the community. Like, what's the purpose of the religious community engaging in like wearing a hijab and wearing like protective clothing? Oftentimes, you can define it in certain ways. You can define it as like religion wanting to oppress like women's rights, and the symbol of oppression is through that. You can probably point out like these are things just like the idea of like inherent, um gender inequality that related to the idea that, oh, wearing a hijab is because you have to protect your sanctity because you are someone who has like other people seeing it might make it seem dirty. You can also explain just the idea that, it's a hijab is probably just a symbol of God. It's a symbol of your faith to your God. It's a symbol of faith to your religion. It's something that people choose to do. So you can also explain the priority of the stakeholder. Like, what do the religious community care more about? What do women in that religious community care more about? The capability of lack of the stakeholders. What can these people do? Like, what can the religious community do when you ban the hijab? Like, what can women do if you ban the hijab? The relationships in relation to other stakeholders. How does a religious community's reaction like have a difference in how the state makes policy, like why the state has to ban the hijab when it's just a religious thing, or like why the religious community will probably like affect other stuff in society right now. You can also look at fourthly the background or the history pertaining to the stakeholder and trend analysis on how they've behaved in similar situations. You can probably see how people have reacted in the past. Last time in France when someone made a cartoon character of the Prophet Muhammad, people were very mad. Like rioters and like protesters actually went to the editing and publishing building and just murdered the editor in chief that allowed for the cartoon of the prophet being particular way, like in a like inappropriate way. Like these are things of how people reacted in the past um when they see it as a affront and they see it as a disrespect and a just an absolute disrespect of their religion. So you can talk about how last time how people reacted in certain ways. Again, these are things that you can just look at it like that. Um Again, yep, let's just contrasting characterization. So on both sides, your characterization has to be like different. Like obviously Gov's premise is that the religious community will moderate itself as a result. The characterization, we can probably be like religious individuals are more peaceful. People have already moved beyond the need for showing faith to their God. They're already like being part of a greater community. Like there's no need for them to like react in a negative way. You have to explain to me why a religious community will act in such way. Ops premise is that religious communities will radicalize further as a result. They characterize it as something that banning the hijab is the biggest part. Like the hijab is the fundamental of life for Muslim women. It's like these are um what makes someone Muslim. Like the equivalent of telling someone to not have a hijab is equivalent to telling them to not wear clothes in public. Like these are important things that we have to like consider into like important parts of a religion that individuals care deeply about, and they will not just let go of that deep they will not let go of that significance of this particular item just because the government tells them to stop wearing it. So as you can see, both of them can be true. Like both of these things might be a result of the government banning the hijab, but it's up to the team that characterizes it and describes it in the most persuasive way possible to explain to me how this is likely. So that's why we just put it back again. Like the characterization is directly integrated into our argument structure. Like remember when we mentioned premise, process, and outcome, characterizations integrate every part of the premise, process, outcome format in the same way. Is that in the premise, you have to explain to, like in the process, you have to explain to me how will the religious community react. The outcome, you have to explain to me why this is a good thing for the religious community and why would they do so. It's always using characterizations to fulfill that argument at the end of the day. It's a basic part of argument building and cannot be, taken away from this. So they're all merged together. So if you're confused, like, what is the characterization? Like, where do I put the characterization in? Point is that you shouldn't think about where you put the characterization in. The characterization should itself be every part of your argument in order to make it persuasive. There's no one part of the argument that doesn't require characterization because you have to always explain to me how will certain people react in certain ways and why people will believe in so, or like why people will take these actions. So it's always asking yourself these questions. That's why it's always going to be in parts of, the argument. Okay, nice. Let's just look at it. Okay, subject matter, problem, trend characterization. All motions will explicitly lead to a subject matter, but it doesn't mention an underlying problem or a trend. Whatever premise which gives rise to the existence of the topic will be the problem or the trend in a question. What this is say, okay, a motion about South Korea, like South Korea stepping out of the US's sphere of influence. Well, the subject matter is very, very clear. It's South Korea. The problem is the US's influence over South Korea. Like, why is this such a bad thing? Like, why is South Korea not, why is the US's influence over South Korea concerning? Like, what's the problem statement? Last is just like the trend. Okay, we made this like a bit long ago, but it's just like Trump's governance. It's like, how Trump has reacted very badly to like, North Korea. And like, but then also at the same time, like Trump is very, very close friends with Kim Jong-un. Like, that's not what South Korea wants itself to be. And, that's the problem. Like, Trump's governance is the exact reason why there's a problem statement over the US's influence over South Korea. There are several factors you can consider when characterizing subject matter. The dysfunctions or flaws on how it operates. What it means is that looking at the current subject matter, like South Korea, what's the dysfunction? Well, the US and South Korea are not getting along. The origin of the problem, explaining the trend. So, why is this the case? Well, Trump's president or Biden's president or like, Kamala Harris is president. Like there are different origins of different problems. The tipping point of the trend. Like, what's the biggest thing that has started and made it very bad? You can talk about like Trump and Kim Jong-un being very, very close friends with each other and have publicly said that they want to be friends and want to be more partnering in, status quo. The failures of status quo in dealing with the subject matter. Like, what has status quo not done that we have to consider this? So why is South Korea being in the US's sphere of influence not able to stop the US like ignoring South Korea's interests? Like the US doesn't care about South Korea right now. That's the problem that you want to tell me. And the problem is that people like South Korea cannot change anything because they are in the US sphere of influence, something like that. So it's always asking yourself, like, what's the problem right now? And like, apart from just the characterization of the subject matter, you also have to just point to me like, why is the subject matter a problem? Like, why do we have to care about this right now? In both, sometimes in debates, like both sides care about the same things. So like, even if you say this, both sides will just be like, yeah, I agree. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes people think that, oh, the South Korea should not like leave the US sphere of influence because there's no problem right now. Like the only way for the South Korea to be protected is through being a friend with the US, something like that. So it's always thinking about whether or not you should do this and thinking about whether or not it's something that you should care about deeply. Okay, there's another motion. This house regrets the rise of the gig economy. Again, there are contrasting characterizations in the subject matter. The Gov premise is that gig economies are the reason for workers' exploitation. The problem is that people are not earning as much right now in their normal jobs, but because the gig economy exists, that's when workers feel as if they are being exploited, like feel as if they have to work two jobs to sustain themselves to live a life. That's not a good thing. Like the gig economy is a result of poor paying and exploitation on behalf of big companies and employers, and workers have to bear the consequence of working two or three jobs in a day. The ops premise is that it empowers the autonomy of workers in a gig economy. Is that, well, a worker can choose not to work in a 9 to 5. Someone doesn't want to work like 8 hours a day and just sit in the office. They want to do other things. Having a gig economy is exactly what allows them to, have that freedom. And the gig economy is exactly what removes the problem statement right now. So as you can see, there are two different problem statements that Gov and Op are telling me. Gov is telling me that the problem statement is that the gig economy is a result of people not having good qualities of life, but still have to bear the burden of the bad quality of life by working too many jobs, like working 12, 13 hours a day. That's Gov's problem statement. Ops problem statement is that currently people do not have enough freedoms. People are forced to work into certain types of industries and seen as that's the only way for them to work. Like if your mom and dad tells you you can only work in this industry because working in an office is better than everything else. That's the reason why people don't have the freedom to do other things. And that's why the autonomy of the workers is solved by that problem statement through the gig economy. So that's how we can see this. There are different problems that both teams are telling me. Again, how each team wins the debate depends on which team provides the characterization better and provides the reasons for a problem statement better at the end of the day. This is the last part of the slide, which, oh, no, actually, yeah, these are the last two slides. Context characterization. Well, the context of the debate is a location that sets the background of the debate. This can be set to a particular nation, a particular region, a continent, or even a smaller subset. In this house will allow people to pardon extremist leaders who commit atrocities during social uprising. Context is post-conflict society. Here's how we characterize post-conflict societies or characterize context. Again, context is where something happens, like where or when does it happen. So again, talk about the widespread struggle of the people within the place, shared value system of the place, collective recollection of the event, how the people in the context have reacted to similar events, the priorities and psyche of the people in that context. Again, it's always asking a question like how, who. It's always, this is where we expand it. Who, what, when, where, why, how. Like there's 6 things to ask. Like these are things we have to ask. Like why are people struggling? What do they both believe in? When it happened, how do people react to that? Like, what do people remember of the post-conflict society? How do people in that context have reacted in the past? The priorities and psyche of the people in that context, something like that. Again, let's just do a motion like this. The extremist leaders motion. There's also contrasting characterization. The Gus premise is that this society has experienced war fatigue and want to build post-conflict reconciliation. They're telling me that they want to characterize that the people are tired about war and they want to build a post-conflict society and everyone wants to forgive each other. That's why you want to pardon extremist leaders who did atrocities. That's fair. You can explain to me why people just don't want to care about these things anymore. They want to move on. They want to have a better life. That's the characterization that you should focus on. The ops premise is that this society is seeking justice after long periods of oppression on both sides in order to move on. What this means is that the fear and the feeling that they are being exploited and oppressed during the conflict doesn't just go away because the social uprising has already ended. Like there are people who have done bad things on both sides, and the only way for people to actually move on in society is by punishing the people who have done atrocities in the past, which is basically what you should focus on. Again, that's a fair characterization. Again, who wins this is again who characterizes it better, who is able to use this context to the greatest extent in explaining why this is true. Okay, this concludes the first part of the workshop. If there are any questions, you may ask them right now. we can have like 2 minutes break. I'll say thank you on behalf of CAP first for letting me host this session. We'll have, and you will hear from many, many other great Malaysian debaters in the next two sessions. And by the time it ends at 5 p.m. But if anyone has any questions right now regarding building an argument and building a context and characterization, you can ask me right now, and I'll be happy to explain them in the next 2 minutes before we pass it on to the next. Anyone? Will the slides be available for us to study? Yeah, I think we will be sharing it out soon. But it will confirm again with the organizers whether or not we can do that. But I think it shouldn't be a problem. If you are worried about like, what are things you should read through, there are a lot of debate resources online. You can also look through like, Team Malaysia's Facebook or like sorry, I think website that there are other debate resources that you can buy from as well. But this is just free for you, so you can just like, take as much as possible. Yeah, anyone else have any questions? Or pass on? Okay, let me see. Where should this characterization be included in? Again, characterizations, so it depends. If you talk about characterization of context, this is oftentimes when you build the debate, like, where does this happen in? But also, yeah, most of the time it's in the process because that's when you need to explain to me how these different things work. But as I said just now in the lecture, characterizations should be integrated in your arguments. So you shouldn't think about where a characterization is needed, but it's in which part, like in every part of the argument, you should think, okay, what's a characterization for this? What's a characterization for the process? What's a characterization for the outcome? It's not just like, oh, here's the process. Do I need a characterization for this? No, every part of the argument has to have some form of characterization. Characterizations is just telling me how it will be like in your world and telling me what it would be like on your side, which is basically the basis of debating in general. So that's why you have to have every part of it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Let's just give it a minute or so. I hope that answers your question. For Atlin, who asked the question. Um, okay. I'm assuming there are no. But if you do have any questions, you can always reach out to us on the Discord. If you're already in the Discord for nationals, we would be happy to answer any questions if you have them over there. But if not, you can just like, drop Team Malaysia a text whenever you need help. Like I'm sure there are people around who are willing to help you. Let me just stop my screen. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending this first part of the lecture. Moving on, we will be doing a lecture on debate, just like debate census in general, just being able to like read the debate better is in terms of like how we do basic case building and how we like choose the things that are important for us. And with that, I will invite Wesley, who is also a member of the CAP 4 Nationals this weekend, to present their presentation. And thank you so much, everyone. I'll see you tomorrow.
Hi everyone, my name is Wesley. I'll be your CAP for this weekend as well. I'm just going to give a really quick workshop on case strategy. So before we start and like talk about case strategy, just really quickly, what is this for? Like you've heard Yang talk about arguments and how we make arguments for the past like 50-ish to an hour. Case strategy is more a holistic thing. So it isn't focused on a single argument or a single way you build these arguments. What it does focus on is direction and the ability for you to position cases in ways that make sense. Yeah, it's better positioning and understanding where your case fits into the greater round and how you interact with the debate as a whole. So what this does is it tells you what your case should run, what it should argue, and like just things in general that we'll talk about, and we'll make sure that your case is a holistic one that was able to stand within rounds and make sure you win debates. That's what a case strategy is. So knowing what is a good burden to take, what you should do in order to enhance your cases, this is all we talked about here. Let's just talk about, before that, if anyone wants to ask any questions, you can ask it in the chat. You can ask it while I'm speaking or after I'm speaking. If I can answer you while I'm speaking, if like your question comes up, then I will do so. But if not, don't worry, you can just put it on the chat and I'll read it all at the end of the lecture. All right. So let's talk about the contents of a case. This is what we call strategic components of a case. So the contents of a case is basically what Yang talked to you about for the better part of an hour just now, which was things like definitions, problems and status quo, mechanisms, yardstick, stance, argument. These are just the cookie cutter ways that you follow step by step as to how to make a case and how to fill in all the gaps of a case that is necessary. You need a mechanism for policy debates, you need a problem, you need to evaluate what your burden is to prove, and you need to give like several arguments. But that's not what we're talking about. We talk about case strategy. What we're more likely talking about is things like clarity, mechanisms, and frame. And it all does just simply being able to make your case more understandable and make your case more strategic. That means you don't want to run a case that is just either super unintuitive, which means people don't believe it, or you don't want to run a case that's just irrelevant. Like in some motions, you run a case with an argument, and then later on, that argument just becomes irrelevant. Like you want arguments to stay relevant in a debate, and this is a very good way in order to do so. You want to impact the things on making sure your case is clear, making sure your arguments have mechanisms in order to make sure that your case actually becomes something that's winning and actually becomes something that's relevant moving forward. And I'll talk about what each of these things as we go on in today. Okay. Let's just talk about clarity. So what is clarity? An explicit definition is not necessary when the ordinary meaning of an emotion is incredibly clear and leaves no room for confusion. For example, if you want to make a debate about this house would ban school buses in a neighborhood, for example, okay, it's not a great motion, but if it's about like banning school buses from a neighborhood, you don't have to come out in the debate and be like, here's what the definition of a school bus is. Like everyone knows what a school bus is. Like these aren't things that are necessary. So don't waste time on defining things that aren't important to the debate. For example, this house would ban smoking. Nobody needs to know what smoking is because I think probably everybody kind of does know what smoking is. What is required is when a mere definition is not enough to provide clarity. That means, for example, where a definition is not necessary is this house will stop sending humans to space. You know what space is? You know what humans are? These things don't need explanations because they're very clear distinctions of what the motion wants you to do. But where a definition alone is not enough to provide clarity is a motion like this house supports a world without citizenship. So first off, maybe some citizenship is something that you want to define because maybe your room is a bit unclear or you want to be clear about what citizenship is. But you don't think that definition is enough in order to like win you a debate, or that definition alone is something that matters. Because what you want to ask when it talks about clarity and when you're explaining like certain parts of the motion is not the meaning of the words itself, but more of how the words apply in the debate. For example, here, if there is no citizenship, do borders and border enforcement exist? If you don't belong to a certain country, does the concept of borders even matter? Because by logic, like borders matter at the point in which you're a citizen of one country, and when you pass over the border to another, you are a citizen in one country in a foreign land. So if there is no citizenship, are there borders? Second question you probably want to ask is, without citizenship, is there an elected government or a nation? Can everybody move freely and vote within elections? Because elections require you to be citizens of countries. So if there is no citizenship, does that mean anyone can vote anywhere? If I fly to the United States today, like, does that mean I can vote in a world where there's no citizenship? Basically, ask yourself very simply, is there room for opposition to ask points of clarification? If you've done your setup, like talked about specific things within your setup, is there any way that opposition will ask you a question that you'd have to waste time answering? If that's the case after your setup, that means there are holes within the speech's clarity that you have not fixed. And you have to go back and look and find areas in order to correct and to check as to where the clarification can happen. So don't do bad definitions. This is just bad faith debating. Don't squirrel the motion. Don't use tautology. Don't time, place, set. Don't use truistic things. These are all like very complex words, but basically don't make definitions incredibly unfair. For example, it's like this house would, for example, the motion like this house supports the feminist movement's ability to protest on the streets. You don't go, this motion is only set in the 1920s when women were fighting for suffrage. No, like this debate is about feminism in most sense, on all senses of the word. Ability to protest on the street isn't about a specific fair and charitable of your definitions and your clarity, because that allows for a better debate to occur. Like you don't want your 90% of your debate to be arguing about whether something is true or false, or whether a definition is correct or wrong. You want to have more fruitful discussions when you're doing debates. So please be a bit clear when it comes to defining certain things and showing how certain things are true or not true in this sense. So 3 elements of case clarity. And we're going to talk about this in an example. So for example, this house will sacrifice civil liberties for national securities. So 3 things here. First is a definition. What are you willing to defend? So civil liberties are personal freedoms. This is explaining what civil liberties are, which are distinct from basic human rights and can be eroded for sake of communal good. For example, privacy and expression. So that means that it isn't like a right to life, but they're more like higher, like later stage rights, like stuff like privacy, stuff like expression. And it's defining exactly what civil liberties are. So that if you don't do this, you open the room for other teams to go like, oh, but are you willing to defend like the police killing people for national security? Of course, we're not willing to defend that. That's why the definition of civil liberties was very important in showing people what you can and what you are willing to take in the debate. Secondly, in terms of context and background. So this isn't like a location. This is what Young talked about. It's the tail end of the lecture just now. But context was important, was illustrating the scenarios and where is it likely to happen. Like, what is this debate likely about? Are there any real world parallels that likely exist? For example, in the civil liberties debate, this debate is about laws such as the Patriot Act, which allows for mass surveillance to crack down on terrorism. Again, this is an illustration of what the debate would look like or what is actually happening in the real world, and not this can only happen in this situation. So while this debate about civil liberties for national security is about the Patriot Act, it's not only about the Patriot Act. It's about multiple other laws that exist within multiple other countries that allow for for civil liberties to be suspended for national security. This can look like the Sedition Act as well. In certain other countries, some countries like Bangladesh has these as well. And finally, and more importantly, about positioning and parallels, right? So what else are you okay with and what else are you not okay with for this purpose? So like the Patriot Act is about mass surveillance, about to crack down on terrorism. What else are you okay with? You're okay with measures such as a no-fly list because you want to stop people from exercising their right to fly to a different country because you want to protect your. What you're not okay with is breaching fundamental human rights. So you don't support torture because that's erosion of human rights. You don't support detention without trial because you want people to at least have their day in court because the civil liberty is okay. You also don't support stuff like extrajudicial killings, like killings that aren't sanctioned by a court or killings that aren't done by self-defense. Like you just kill people because you think they're bad people. Like you're clearly not okay with defending this. And this is where you are clear in the debate about what you want to talk about and what conversations are not and should not be part of the debate. And this is very important when you do case setup and when you do case direction, is because if you don't do this, what oftentimes happens is you get yourself forced into defending things that are really hard to defend. So let's say you never did any of this, like any of these 3 things, and you're just like, you know what, civil liberties are just things that people should be protected and we're going to suspend them. And the next speaker is just going to come out and say, all right, so you're great killing people. Like, you don't want to defend that. And you don't want to waste time saying why you don't have to defend that or why you're somewhat okay with that, because you don't. Don't waste time and energy and analysis proving something you don't have to. With clarity and with the ability to be strategic, you step out from all of this. You prevent yourself from having to defend or waste time proving why you don't have to defend this earlier. That means when you do it early, you don't fall into the trap of having to defend it later. Hardline versus softline definitions. I want to be very clear on this. I feel quite strongly about this. So this is something that is very important. So what is the difference between a hardline and a softline definition? This is very easily seen in this example that's in the slides. In a motion about this house will legalize abortion. A hardline debate would be we legalize abortion at all stages. That means no matter what stage of the pregnancy the child is at, you are likely to legalize abortion. Can everybody hear me? Is my mic a bit bad?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Wait, let me. Is this better? Okay, I'm gonna assume this is better. So when we talk about abortion, talk about legalizing abortion, there are 3 lines that you can take in terms of case prep and the ability to choose a line to debate. So the hard line would be to legalize abortion at all stages. That means no matter where you are in the pregnancy, no matter where you are in the trimester, these are things that you're going to legalize, and these are things that you're going to allow happen regardless. A moderate line would be we only legalize abortion during the first trimester, which is only in the first 3 months of the baby being incepted or the baby being supplanted into the uterus. Then only you're going to legalize abortion. After a certain period of time, you're not going to allow this to happen. A soft line cases will be, oh, we're only going to legalize abortion for instances of medical purposes or victims of sexual assault or victims of sexual assault. So these are three lines you can take in an abortion debate. What is the problem with the soft line? A soft line case makes too many exceptions to the point where it's no longer a fair or ordinary term interpretation of the motions. Teams try to take soft line cases in order to be less controversial. That means you want to defend less things. That's why you want to take soft line cases. But soft line cases are harder to defend because, number one, they result in a lot of moral inconsistencies. And number two, the scale of solution doesn't correspond to the scale of the problem. Right? So that means when you take soft line cases, very oftentimes either the harm you're arguing also occurs to you because you're making so many exceptions in your case, or that the benefit you're trying to get is also being able to be achieved by the other side because of the exceptions you're making. So your benefit either doesn't materialize or doesn't occur to the full length of your benefit, or that your harms also apply to yourself. And I feel very strongly about this. Like, the ability for you to run a soft line case feels like you don't think that you can win any other way. So you take this like one narrow line that you think is the only best way of winning. But that's not true. Very oftentimes you can take hardline stances and are better able to win debates that way. Why? It's because hardline cases actively clash with the other side. That means softline cases has a lot of overlap. Like, you're arguing things like, we're going to legalize abortion only when it's necessary. That means you do admit that there are some times that abortion is bad. So there is overlap when Op argues that abortion is bad. You kind of say like, yeah, abortion is bad sometimes, but here are the 1-2 times in which it's okay and we're going to legalize it then. Like, these are the overlaps you don't want to have, because then you're not able to either get your benefits or able to push your harms. And I do have a very strong preference for just straight hardline cases. Moderate line cases are fine in certain instances, but they become very tricky if you don't know where the line is and why that line exists. Which means hardline cases makes everything much clearer. You're able to see what harms exist when they push it, what harms exist on your side, what benefits exist on your side, and then you can better do things like weighing, like rebutting, like building arguments, because you're very clear with what your line is, right? So teams should aim to take hard lines or moderately hard lines when defining context of debate. For me, I have a personal preference to hardline cases because I can just see benefits and harms much clearer, but it's not like a necessity. You can opt into moderate line cases if you think they are strategic. There's an example down there about, like, I don't want to do the voting is compulsory one. There's an example down there about military intervention in the land in Somalia. The difference between a hardline and a softline case would be, is this military peacekeeping or military peacemaking? Are we going there to stand there with the guns and like stop them from shooting the civilians? Or are we going to actively join the conflict in order to make sure that peace happens? A softline case would be standing in front of the people and making sure that you're just there for defense. Like, sure, you can prove that, but that's really soft. What you want to do is you want to argue that we are most likely going to join the conflict in some significant way so that the conflict ends and we're better able to get peace. Because being a peacekeeper doesn't get you that benefit, or like it's really hard for you to prove that benefit that you're going to get peace in the long term. Being a peacemaker gives you a very clear path as to how you get that benefit. So it's a quicker line and a better line into proving where the benefit comes from and where the benefit materializes. Next. So let's discuss. We have to discuss this. Okay, we can look at this very briefly. I can come back to this later if I have time. So, in a motion like this, House believes that there are important decisions about children's health that should be made by medical professionals. Right? So, remember the three things you have to do: definition, context, and background position and paragraph. So, by important decisions, we mean health decisions that affect the ability to live. And then you fill in the blanks after that. So, what do we mean by children's health? Like, we mean the ability to live and live a good life. Such as, for example, when it comes to children's health, do we give them blood transfusions if they are lacking? If they like lost a lot of blood? Are we able to put them into incubators if they're born prematurely? So these are instances that you want to do, and you want to be clear about things. So what is this debate about? So this is something that is very clear. Like, first you want to define what kind of health decisions are you talking about. So you're not talking about like small level health decisions. These are probably health decisions that really impact the ability to live or die. Things like incubation, things like blood transfusion, things like surgery. What is this debate about? So this is not like context, again, like the previous example. This debate is clearly about instances where medical professionals disagree with parents, right? Because if it was about parents that agree with medical professionals, there would not be a debate because they agree on the same things. So this debate is clearly about instances where there's a disagreement, who should be able to make that final decision. What are we okay and not okay with? So we are clearly not going to be okay with doctors just doing things to the kids without informing the parents. Obviously, there's going to be a chain of information. You're probably going to inform the parents of certain decisions that should be made and tell them that these are important things you have to make for the child. What the debate, therefore, is about the final decision. We think information would happen. Still, doctors are not going to do this with no control. That's how you do clarity. Just these three things. What is the definition of important, clear parts of the debate, which is less about what it means and more like what it looks like. And that's something I want to be very clear about definition. Definitions are very infrequently or very often not what it means, but what it looks like. So it's a lot of illustration and examples as to what the word is trying to say, rather than the dictionary definition of the word. Because if you needed the dictionary definition of the word, anyone in the round could just open a dictionary. What you are more interested to doing is explaining what this looks like. Secondly, you talk about context and background. Again, what is this debate actually about? Look at it as a big picture lens. My God. And then finally, positioning and parallels. What you're okay with, what you're not okay with. This allows you to at least shift the debate in a certain instance in which it's more strategic for your sentence. Okay, before we talk about mechanisms, are there any questions right now? For now, I give you 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, no questions. Let's go into mechanisms. And before this, I want to preface, mechanisms are talking about the ways that you explain or the ways that you prove arguments happen. This is important because if you lack mechanisms, you lack links into parts of the debate that are important. Which means very often teams can lose debates by the lack of mechanisms that your argument have, basically and very simply because their argument just isn't convincing anymore. So if you want to make convincing arguments, you have to focus on mechanisms and how mechanisms work. In an action debate, this refers to your mechanism, model, policy, or any detailed plan that you are proposing. For example, this house will cut welfare support for compulsive gamblers. So what you're trying to say is, what does this look like? How does this manifest? And what is the procedure that you're going to do so? Mechanisms aren't convincing you whether something is true. Mechanisms are telling you how something works. Like, for example, in this motion, we will mandate an entry process for any casino or gambling like den or hall to identify welfare recipients. You will set a monthly limit on how many times you're allowed to gamble and the total money that they're willing to gamble on. If you exceed that limit, you cut off your welfare. This is very clear as to what is going to happen, how we're going to check it. So the first one is talking about enforcement, and the second one talks about when are we cutting them off from their welfare. So we're not just immediately cutting it off for all gamblers, we're cutting it off for compulsive gamblers. That means you're setting a limit on the money that they can spend and what you're going to do if they surpass this limit. Sometimes this is not necessary. This is not necessarily for value or fact. For example, this house believes that Obama administration's foreign policy has done more harm than good. The value argument is that it worsens foreign and global sentiments against the US. You don't have to mechanize as to like what you're going to do about global sentiments or how foreign sentiments work. Those are more explanations. So they aren't full mechanisms. However, some value debates require explanation of what policy would be, even if you're not required to defend the feasibility of the policy. For example, in a world where when you argue this house believes that public services are best run by private companies, so it's a value judgment debate, but you still have to argue at least in some level how it looks like. For example, in this world, the state will afford a revocable tender to companies who run public services. You don't have to defend that this is exactly how it's going to work, but you can argue that this is probably how it looks like, and this is enough mechanisms for the debate to function. But I want to add on a bit as to terms of value judgment. Like, while you don't have to mechanize value judgment debates, explaining things in ways that show the detailed process of how things look like very oftentimes can help you being persuasive. So while it's not a compulsory thing that you can argue it wasn't foreign and global sentiments, it is strategic and helpful to prove how these foreign and global investments sentiments get worse, or like why it got worse. and how that reversing this will make it get better. Those are mechanisms. They're not really detailed mechanisms, but they are steps you can do in order to make sure that your case at least feels more robust and more persuasive. There are two elements of mechanisms. For example, this house would legalize the sale of human organs. Two things. First, on effectiveness. The mechanism must directly deal with the problem statement. The pricing of organs will follow market supply and demand. And to ensure there is the sufficient economic incentive for people to sell their organs, the sale of organs can only be conducted by the state, no middlemen or agencies allowed. So when the motion talks about legalizing the sale of human organs, when you talk about effectiveness, you're talking about how this is likely to happen in the most effective and beneficial way for your case. Secondly, on safeguards and caveats, to prepare for obvious harms and mitigations, right? Because if you look at the motion, don't look at the bottom part, just look at the motion itself. Clearly, you think an opposition is going to run, oh, this is going to be bad because people are going to organ traffic and kidnap people and steal their organs, which is why a safeguard needs to exist. Because if you're the first speaker, let's say you're prime minister, you want to introduce a lot of these safeguards so they can't argue these things, because arguing these things make the debate really messy and moves the debate away from what it should be. And also it wastes your time, and it's not strategic as a team to waste time arguing on things that opposition is going to bring up when you can very easily take them out using safeguards and caveats. For example, organ donors must not be able to sell at the detriment of their own health. They must receive permission from their doctors, and full health risks must be disclosed. That means if you want to donate an organ, you have to go to a doctor. The doctor will tell you all the risks of removing an organ from your body, and it can't be like your heart, because then you'll die. So no, you're not able to donate your heart while you're still alive. And then the public healthcare system must buy and subsidize the purchase of organs for low income groups. So if you're poor and you need a kidney, the state should give you a discount on the kidneys that you're buying. So this is to prevent opposition from saying, oh, but then what if the poor people can't afford these kinds of things because they're all going to be really expensive? Okay, here's the way that becomes less expensive for these people. And by doing this, it allows you to at least focus the debate on what you should analyze to be the more important things, rather than allowing yourself to be sucked into opposition's world and arguing those things that they think are important. These safeguards allow you to at least have the first mover's advantage as to why these things aren't actually problems. That means it is not you dealing into op when op says that, oh, people will just donate their organs without thinking, or oh, people can't buy. Now op has to gauge in you, because you already told them this is not going to happen. Opposition has to prove why this is going to happen despite the things that you told them, and then why it's bad. So save this mechanisms, actually what it does is the first part allows you to make sure that your case makes sense. The second part allows you to protect your case in a way that it's doubly as hard for any opposition team to take down. This is why mechanisms are important, because not only do they win you the debate, but they also make sure that the opponents can't dismantle your things. And this is incredibly valuable, especially if you don't think maybe your responses are as good, or you're able to, the ability for you to answer opposition is not that great. This is a way that you can do that before they even speak. Do I have time for this? We can come back to this a bit later. Very quickly, it's this house requires individuals to pass a political general knowledge test in order to vote. What you're doing in effectiveness is you're telling them how a political general knowledge test is probably going to be carried out and who can take this test. That's under effectiveness. We'll talk about analysis later if I have time. And the safeguards and caveats is what is the test going to be? Is it going to be hard? Is it going to be easy? How are you going to protect against people cheating on these tests? And just things that opposition is likely going to say, and just ability for you to safeguard against your case and safeguard against the policy it works. We'll come back to this if we have the time later, because we are not the best in timing. Finally, the last thing to talk about is framing. And framing is important because it allows you to show, or at least move a judge's mind and perspective into what is an important part of the debate. So framing is an exercise of showing what is the most important thing within the debate. For example, you can use a compelling narrative on the vulnerability of a particular actor, then you position yourself as the team that saves actor X. The team that protects actor X is the best team that wins the debate. So if you're able to tell me why a specific group of people were the most important in the debate, then you were able to say that whoever saves this group of people was the one that won the debate. So you're showing me why you saving these people was important and why the fact that you did it was the most important action within the round. Framing is also an exercise of excluding things that you should not matter in this debate. Again, for the thing about this house will only allow registered organ donors to receive organ donations. This debate is not about people who can't donate their organs due to religious reasons, because the same people will also refuse to receive organ donations. So, if you were a religious individual and you didn't want to donate your organs, probably, very likely, you'd probably also not want to receive an organ. So, if you are not a person that would consent to giving or getting an organ, then the debate is not about you. For example, trying to think of a specific debate. If this debate is about like, okay, never mind. I'll come to the example later. Simply, you are allowed to move and position the debate in order to exclude things that you don't think this debate talks about or very unfruitful information. Setting a value or metric of debate is a type of framing. Your attempt to shape and tell the judge what is the priority of the debate. Saying something is not your burden is also a type of framing. So, for example, if government tries to argue that opposition needs to prove the likelihood of these things changing, you as opposition can just say, it's not our burden to prove that these things change. It's our burden to prove that the process of it is bad. That is framing. That is telling you what you should be able to do, what you don't have to do, what is important within the round, what is not important within the round. So it's debating around the arguments rather than debating the arguments themselves, because you're telling the judge why was this argument important, and then you engage within the argument itself. That's framing. Framing is drawing circles and graphs around your argument as to prove why they were important or why other arguments were less important or why other lines of frame or like arguments that op can make were not part of this debate. That's framing. There is no exhaustive list as to how to frame the debate. All you're doing in framing is looking at a bigger picture and asking yourself, what will win me the debate? And then you frame the issue around. For example, if you're talking about this house supports progressive taxation policy, that means the poor people get taxed less than the rich people, asking yourself, what will win you the debate? Probably on Gov, what will win you the debate is the ability for you to say that poor people get protected. So that means the debate gets framed around the issue that these poor people are the most important people because they don't have money, cannot access opportunities, cannot access food and water, cannot access basic needs. That's why they're important. And then you frame the debate around the issue. Because we're able, with this policy, to help the poor people, that's how we win the debate. But secondly, it also gets yourself to ask, which are obvious harms from other teams that will distract you from the main issues? And is there a reasonable way to frame that out of the debate? So in the progressive taxation debate, if opposition comes about, what about the rich people that they need to get their money too? Like, that's distracting. You don't want to spend 5 minutes of a 7-minute speech talking about why rich people like should or should not get the money. So in first prop, you can just simply kind of like, okay, if it means we justify taking some money away from rich people, that's fine. They're rich, they can probably afford it. That allows you to frame out any discussion about that group of people in that way. So it doesn't distract you from what is important in the debate about whether this was a good policy to help the people that you cared about. You can also use analysis and examples to build a narrative of importance at the very first beginning of prop speech. Here's how you can do this. These are nice buzzwords. Buzzwords are words that like sound good. Tipping point framing. The urgency of your case makes it the biggest priority in the debate. Like, this exact thing that we're doing is the tipping point or the reason why the impact happens. Or this process is a tipping point as to why we should do this. That's a tipping point framing, as to show you why this was important, because without this outcome won't happen. Whoa, who drew over my board? Please don't. Thank you so much. Clear all viewers' drawings. All right. Please don't draw on the board, guys. Thank you. Secondly, we talk about moral parallel framing. To deny your case will be to reject all established moral norms. So this can look like, if you deny the case, you deny the fact that poor people deserve the right in order to be protected by the government, and that is denying a moral norm. Drastic problem solve for drastic measures framing. Everything we've tried has failed. The severity of the problem can no longer be ignored. The severity of the problem can no longer be ignored. For example, like, this house supports violent acts of protests for underprivileged communities, like the Black Lives Matter, the feminist movement. So this frame at the first prop would be like, all other methods in order to save ourselves and our communities have failed. We have tried the political process, we have tried the social process, this has failed. If this is the only way to get them to listen to us, this is the most important thing that we have to do because nothing else can. That's a very powerful framing that proves to you why Op cannot just argue, well, what about trying other things? Your answer to that in first prop is the fact that, yeah, we've tried all other things. They're terrible. They don't work. This must be done. And these are frames that are important in order to make your case sound very convincing to begin with. Framing can also be positive or negative, as long as it serves the purpose of shaping the perspective of the judge. You want the judge to adjudicate the entire debate through the lens of your framing. For example, this house would legalize incest. Incest is when you like sleep with your family members. So in the debate about this house would legalize incest, this is how a frame looks like. It serves the purpose as to shape the judge's perspective. Talk about it in this way. Either way, incest will continue to exist. Regardless if we legalize or not, some people would still want to do this for some reason that they want. The difference is we allow people to talk about it openly, seek support systems, and save those that are trapped in bad abusive relationships. So it doesn't allow, what this does, it allows you to frame your debate about the ability for you to be open and conversational about this thing. That means that any of Op's arguments about why incest is bad doesn't really apply because you're going to say that, okay, even if we believe our position, these things still happen under our position's world. So Op can rant and rave about the fact that this is bad as long as they want. But insofar as they can't prove that this stops happening, government allows you to have better conversations and better protections for people who do engage in these things. And that's a very powerful frame because it tells your judge that this debate is not about incest good versus incest bad. This debate is about where do we best get conversations around incest. And that is something that's important. So the judge is less likely to buy the arguments about incest bad and more likely to buy your arguments about why is it that we better protect people? Why is it that conversations are better? Why is it that we are able to have support structures for people who may or may not know what is this about? And these are conversations that are important, that you can argue that in debate, and judges are more likely to value the things that you have done versus the things that opposition has done because of the frame. Secondly, this also legalize abortion. What banning abortions does is increase the death of mothers who do back alley abortions or try to force themselves into miscarriage. If you ban abortions, it leads us to increase activities like baby dumping and infanticide. It sends more children into foster care and unloving homes. It puts more children in responsibility of parents who never wanted them to do this. There's one thing banning abortions doesn't do: actually stop abortions. What this is trying to just say is that if you ban an abortion, what is going to happen is abortions still take place because the need is the same. On both sides, people still want to get rid of their kids. On opposition side, these people either get rid of their kids in worse ways or fail to get rid of kids, and then the lives of these born kids are so much worse. So the debate isn't about abortion good or abortion bad, or at least that shouldn't be the debate. The frame allows you to step away from abortion good versus abortion bad and allows you to step into what are the ability for us to help the people who want them anyways, and why on our side of the house it is a better world for the people who do want to abort their kids or do want to not have a child, and why those lives are better versus what the lives look like on their side of the house. Which means framing is very important, not just for illustrating where your case should be, but also talking about things like the comparative. Like framing is very easy to talk about where the comparatives happen. What is framing for these three motions? We can get to this later if we have the time. What is the time? I can't see the time, but that's fine. Okay, yeah, 1 second. Sorry guys, give 1 second. I messed something up a bit. Okay, we're back. How about case? This is an example of full case building for the side of opposition. Oh, for the side of government, my bad. This house will allow corporal punishment in schools. And this is the full manifestation of what debate strategy looks like and what it can For example, in this house, we allow corporal punishment for schools. How do you do this step by step? First, we talk about definition. Remember, a definition is not what is corporal punishment, but what corporal punishment looks like. Examples of what is considered corporal punishment. For example, caning a child, hitting them with a ruler, making them, basically physically hitting a child in order to make sure they inflict pain to know that something's wrong. Context and background. What is this debate about? Is there any recent events? This country banned corporal punishment recently. Corporal punishment caused the kid to be sent to the hospital. Like, what is this debate actually talking about? And what is the background behind this? Are teachers doing corporal punishment now? Are they doing it in an extreme way? Is there anything else you're related to this or you are or not okay with? So if you're going to allow corporal punishment, why are you not okay with? We're not okay with teachers actively harming kids. So, for example, we're not okay with certain levels of harm. If a teacher like beats up a child till they can't stand, that's clearly bad. If a teacher pushes a child down the stairs in terms of punishment, that's bad. What we are okay with is like hitting them on the hand with a ruler, hitting them across the shoulder with a book when they don't do something. Those are forms of corporal punishment that we probably think is fine because they don't enact that severe levels of harm on the kid. What is the status quo and what we're planning to solve? What is the status quo as to why corporal punishment is needed and what does corporal punishment plan to solve? This can talk about behaviors of kids within classes, the ability for them to respect their teachers, unfair and unsafe and unconducive learning environments. These are all things that you want to talk about as to what you're planning to solve with corporal punishment. How do you have corporal punishment? Are there any safeguards? This is a mechanism that happens in the debate. What is the motto? How are you going to have corporal punishment? Is it going to be public? Is it going to be by teacher? Is it going to be mandated? Is it going to be a level? If teachers go too far, what are you going to do? Are you going to go give them the court? Are you going to charge them? Are you going to fine them? Are you going to sack them and make sure and fire them and make sure they don't have a job? Are there safeguards that you can do to prevent the worst kinds of harm from happening? Finally, what is the most important thing in the debate? When it's about corporal punishment, how do you plan to win the debate? So the debate, therefore, what is this debate really about in terms of framing and what is the most important? When allowing corporal punishment in the school, what is important is the case of you are enabling a better environment for the kids who want to learn and want to improve in order to do well. These are people that need it the most because very often they come from places in which they can't have any other opportunities, and school is very often the only opportunity that they get. If we prove that these kids are better able to get better environments and therefore can break out of their cycles, these are things that are good. That's how you do a frame. So remember, these are all things we talked about. It's a step-by-step process into asking yourself. Ask these questions when you think about a case prep before your arguments. Answer these questions in order to make sure that you get the full extent of the case. Let's talk about opposition for a bit. Just because you don't have a policy to propose does not mean you don't have a case set up. Every op team will be forced to defend some form of counterfactual, so you must make clear as to what you're willing to defend. Opposition has three abilities to make a counter setup. Number one, the clash. What is the main opposition to the government policy? Are you going to make any tactical concessions? What is your positions in regard to the motion? So, in this house, we ban smoking. We agree that smoking is harmful. We do not defend that smoking is a healthy choice. But we will defend a person's freedom to smoke, and the state cannot intervene even on a healthy life choices. So, in this house, we ban smoking. Opposition is not going to say, we think smoking is great. Opposition is probably just saying, no, we think smoking is pretty bad. What we are defending is the ability for people to choose to smoke. So you're shifting the debate. The debate is no longer about is smoking bad. The debate is about should this choice be allowed. And that's how opposition can use the same things that Gov has in terms of framing, in terms of mechanisms, and push back against them. A counterfactual. Do you support status quo despite the government? Are there additional measures to improve status quo? Do you support a counter proposition or any alternatives? Again, in this house, we ban smoking. If governments want to ban them in all areas, we can say that we don't think we can ban smoking entirely in these places. We think there are, for example, in counterfactual, areas that you can prohibit smoking. For example, in school areas where there are young children whose health are impacted, we think those areas can be smoke-free zones. We don't think we're going to ban smoking entirely. We think what is more reasonable is setting up certain areas where people can be harmed immensely to prevent them from smoking there. That's a counterfactual. Finally, in frame, what's important in this debate and what are you not required to prove? So again, up here says, we're not going to require to prove that smoking is good. Clearly, smoking is bad. What we are required to prove, what is important, was telling you why the choice or individual's ability to choose their own lifestyle, absent of a state, was something that was uniquely beneficial and uniquely empowering on the side of opposition. That's the frame. And that's how you and opposition can allow to bleed into the debate, even though you don't have the necessary need to set up a full case or full policy. My mouse is gone. Okay, found it. How does opposition case setup look like? This house will provide a guaranteed universal basic income. Basically means everybody gets the same income instead of everybody getting welfare. So instead of like making a hospital free every month, everybody in the country gets 1,000 ringgit, for example. So again, with the three things that I talked about just now, clash and position. We agree that welfare for those below the poverty line, such as food stamps, health insurance, and public housing, we just don't support UBI as the method of welfare. We don't support giving money to those who don't need it. That causes more harm than good. That means you're not saying that you don't like welfare on opposition. That's not an opposition burden. What you are saying is there are other methods of welfare that are better. This is just one we don't want. A counter setup. What are you probably going to do instead of having UBI? You're going to strengthen accessibility to public services such as healthcare and education. You're going to build more schools, build more hospitals, make sure the roads to get to those schools and hospitals are properly paved. You're going to have better provision of job and minimum wage as a primary alternative. Basically, you don't want to give everyone money. Instead, you want to give everybody a job so they have the potential to get money. And you want to make the wage in those jobs significantly high enough so that people do get money in order to subsist themselves. That is what you want instead of just flat out giving these people money. Finally, what is the frame? A UBI will completely destroy the economy because of higher taxation rates, lower productivity, and lower innovation, all the other public services as it siphons the majority of public funds. That is the frame as to why this was important. This was bad for the economy because of its ability to detract and pull away from other aspects of the economy that was more important. This is an opt case setup. Again, it's pretty much the same things as you go back here, but they are just simplified because very often an opt case setup is a response to this on Gov, which means this is a simplified version that allows you to be flexible and be responsive on the side of opposition. I'm not going to do this. This is MVP. Yeah, let's not talk about that. And that is about it in terms of opposition case setup. Again, here, clash, counter setup, framing, pay tax everyone according to how much they pollute. You're probably going to say about we are not supporting pollution on the side of opposition. That's dumb. We'll probably just say we don't want people to be taxed this way. And then what is a counter setup? We think a lot of the times what it's going to be is the more awareness as to pollution. It could be more like fines as to pollution instead, or it could be like government crackdowns as to companies that pollute. Please don't draw on the board. Thank you. I don't want to say this again. Right? And finally, in terms of framing, what was this debate actually about? This debate about people that maybe don't have the opportunity or the access to cleaner lifestyles that they have no choice but to pollute. This is why it is better for those individuals. Very simple framing. This is an example. Yeah, that is all for the debate, the lecture on framing. Are there any questions? No questions. Is there a specific scope for the motion tomorrow? I can't tell you that. I can't. Will framing make it a higher chance for you to win the debate? Yes, definitely. Because without a frame, you don't have the ability to control the debate. This is something I tell other people that I coach as well. You have limited control over the debate. You only have the ability to control the debate during the 7 minutes or 8 minutes that you go up and speak. You want to be able to exercise the most control when you are speaking, because when you sit down, the debate has left your control. It is then up to the judge. You want to make the decision-making power, or as much as control of the debate, in the hands of the speakers rather than the hands of the judge. That's why framing was important, because framing allowed you to control how the judge perceived the debate and what they found was important, rather than letting the judge themselves decide what was important. That's why framing is important, because it allowed you to tell the judge that things that you were talking about was the most important, and that's why they should believe you more so than should be for your opponent. That's the difference. And that's why I think framing is very important, and the fact that, yes, clearly you have a high chance of winning the debate. Yeah, anything goes. There's no specific scope for the motions. Be prepared, I guess. Any other questions? Are you able to control the opposition as well in the debate when you use framing? That's a very subjective question and depends on the opposition that you're debating against. If you frame, what it guarantees the fact is opposition has to deal with your framing somehow. Either they tell them why the frame isn't good, or they say why their arguments still operate in the frame, or they do a counter framing that allows them to disprove that fact. The reason why this was still, you still should do it even if they could do all these three things that I just said, is because these things take time in opposition. Any amount of time opposition spends trying to dismantle your frame is time they don't get to use in order to make sure that they prove their case. You are siphoning resources away. How long do you have for prep time? 30 minutes. Does opposition have to focus on going outside government's frame or setting your own frame? That depends on the opposition. Do you think it's strategic to go outside government's frame? Can you win within government's frame? Do you have a better frame that you can use to prove why your arguments were more important? It's up to the opposition. These are very subjective things. It depends on place and time, depends on the round, depends on the motion, depends on your speakers, your team members, depends on what you think the case is, depends on the opposition that you're speaking against. It depends on a lot of things. None of them are objectively wrong answers. You can do and both, but it really depends. Yeah, it's 30 minutes. How can you get better at framing? I have a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is you do more, you prep more cases, you do more debates. Eventually, you'll get better at it. The long answer is you have to change the way you perceive arguments and perceive debates. And that either comes with watching a lot of debate videos, prepping a lot of debates, doing a lot of debates. Again, it's like the same answer. But what you want to do is look at a debate outside just the arguments and the one-by-one issues. Zoom out and see the debate as a whole, and then you're able to move parts of the debate in different areas. That's how you frame. And that's as best as I can explain it to you about how you get better. The short answer is do more. Watch more debate videos, debate more debates, prep more cases. If you don't have the time to debate very often or every weekend, if you have like other things to do or like better things to do with your life, like some people do, what you can do is watch a lot of debate videos. That's like a shortcut or a cheat code to get you to understand. Because not only do you hear how other people frame, but you're able to develop your own understanding about what framing is. Because you hear people thinking like, oh, maybe this could work. And that's the way that you want to get around it. During prep time, can you use gadgets? No. I mean, we can't check, but we'll find out. And it's not that hard for judges to tell when you're using gadgets and when you're not. So please don't. Because if you will listen to a briefing tomorrow, there will be consequences if you do. Guys, try to keep the questions about the lecture or like the session that we just had rather than debate questions. I can answer them, but we want to move on as quickly as possible. We don't have a lot more time. So last couple of questions, 2 more minutes, then I will pass it on already. Okay. I'm gonna assume there are no more questions. Thank you everybody for your time. I'll pass the workshop to the last member of the how should I one really last question. That's I almost missed this. How should I go on getting a new perspective on the topic? What you're asking for a new perspective in terms of like getting better at frame, aren't really perspective on the topic. You're trying to get a new perspective of how you see debating as a whole. In terms of the topic, read articles. That's the only way you get better, or like listen to debaters talk about the issues, even though sometimes they may not be right. That's another way to get a new perspective. What you're trying to do is not get a new perspective on topics, because topics change. What you're attempting to do is get a new perspective on the way you see debates. I think that's more important. And to do that, same as above, do more, prep more, watch more. All right, that's enough time for questions. I've taken a lot of the time. I'll pass it to the last person doing the workshop, which is going to be on responses. So if you want to know how to take down other people's frames or other people's arguments, please listen to this. It'll be by Sarah.
My name is Sarah, and I'm a part of the Edge Core for tomorrow's tournament. Yeah. So what I'll be explaining today in terms of the workshop will be on rebuttals, or specifically on responses. And I often get this question, which is, how important are rebuttals? Because I think the common problem within the school circuit is often the rebuttals being quite rather short, or in certain instances, not exactly taking down the premises or the total case coming from the opponents. And that's something that I hope I can flag out in terms of the importance as we go through the slide, but also something that everyone in this call should take note of, which means rebuttals should not just be a checklist where you want to just, have at the top of your speech, or perhaps you want to rebut or refute every single thing that your opponent says. Rebuttal, in my personal opinion, is also something that goes to do with strategy. So the same thing that Wesley told you in terms of framing being a very, very important, I guess, matter within your speech, rebuttal is just as like the same thing, which means the way that you navigate through, for example, should I rebut this? Or for example, if you notice, if you've ever looked at your paper as you're debating, is you would have 5 things, but you will realize that actually 3 of the things are frankly similar, right? So that's something that we will talk about within this particular, I guess, slide, okay? Right, so the first one that we're going to talk about here is on rebuttal strategies. So this is very, very important because this also clarifies the things that I was talking about just now in terms of how often you have too many things to actually talk about, too many things that you think if you don't take out, you might lose. But then again, if you actually look into understanding perhaps what your opponent is saying, certain like stuffs can just be rebutted just in terms of having a proper strategy when you're coming into that particular, your speech, when you're doing that on top of your speech whatsoever. So in terms of rebuttal strategies, if we see what we have on slide here, it basically talks about how anything that basically, anything that disproves or waters down your opponent's point is a rebuttal, right? So there are no limited number of ways that you can rebut a point. And that's why often you will realize a lot of people kind of have trouble in terms of thinking that they are actually rebutting, but in reality, you can't hear me? Can I be heard? Aulia, okay, thank you so much, Audrey. Yeah, so as I was saying, sorry, I have a really bad sore throat. So in terms of how there isn't actually a limit, like a specific way that you should be rebutting a point, as long as you feel that you are disproving or in a way you are watering down their points, that should be good enough. How long do we have for rebuttals? It totally depends on, like, in my opinion, on like the round in itself, which means perhaps if you have a very solid team that you are responding to, what I know is in that 7-minute speech, please do not spend more than like 3 minutes of your time just rebutting. But there are, for example, times perhaps where you don't think, you think that a lot of the materials that you are giving within your substantives already engages with a lot of the materials that's coming from your opponent, then you can just flag it out to the judge. And that's how you are able to optimize time. So I truly think that it depends on the round, but just remember to look at your timer quite a lot in terms of doing your rebuttals, because you might be a little bit indulgent. Okay, please ask me questions like after I'm done with the slides, yeah? So there are 5 broad categories of rebuttals. So the most popular one and the most common one is for you to just basically prove why the particular things that were said are just essentially not true. And this is the way that you're able to neutralize or, for example, deconstruct the point. The second thing that you can do is just flip their point. So for example, flip about how like a benefit that they say is important can be flipped, for example, into something that you, for example, have as well, or for example, flipped into something that perhaps is a bigger problem and now becomes a harm, right? The third thing is just to basically say that the things that they have stated is something that's not important. And this comes perfectly within framing. So for example, when Wesley told you about how in like motions about banning smoking, you are like, if you are on opposition, you are basically strategically saying how it's actually the choice that is the most important. Similarly, when you're doing rebuttals, you have to find out exactly what's the most important thing within this debate. It could be perhaps the heart of the debate, like what this debate essentially wants, or for example, understanding like how you're able to have a bigger scale in terms of like proving why you win that particular scale, right? So this is another way that you're able to do your rebuttals as well. Number four, you can also undermine or you can also mitigate a lot of the harms that they push on you. So for example, saying things like, even if we take this at our worst, why we are still able to solve it. Or for example, even if we trade this off, right? Why, for example, this will still be something that we will have exclusively. That is how you're still able to mitigate or, for example, undermine the harms that they necessarily have or the benefit that they are trying to push, right? And last but not least is the even if or comparison. And it's very similar. So the fourth one is more towards proving why, for example, you are able to like solve it or you are able to at the very least mitigate this. But when you're doing an even if comparison, you're doing the job for the judge in terms of weighing, like even if in the worst circumstances, or even if we were to be charitable and we were to take Gov at their best, why is this still a problem? These are also ways that you're able to do a form of strategic rebuttals. Okay. The next point here is to kind of talk about how you should recognize how much rebuttal is needed for the argument you heard. And this is very important, right? Most of the time we get very, very overwhelmed with a lot of the arguments, or perhaps if they have a very solid case and you can't find the loopholes to kind of prove why you are like better than the other team, right? So I think in terms of doing this, the 3 points under is actually very important. Number one, what you can do is to understand how you're able to like engage with perhaps a winning argument, right? If, for example, your opponent gives a solid argument and you think that this is a very glaring argument that if you do not like take down, they will definitely take over you. This is when you should, for example, be doing multiple layers of rebuttals. And I get the question a lot in terms of how do we deconstruct the essence of your opponent's case? A lot of the times, what I've noticed is teams tend to give like 1 sentence to 2 sentence like responses. And I personally think that is less strategic, right? So what you can try to do here when I say multiple layers of rebuttals, and we will look into that later in the later slides, is to kind of deconstruct that in a sense where you can give 3 reasons how you take down their winning argument, right? So it's exactly the same way you expand your argument within like the previous lectures that you have heard. Apply the same thing as well within your rebuttals, right? So it's the same thing in terms of making it as clear as possible for the judge to be able to understand why you are winning, or why, for example, the things that's said by your opponent is still something that you have in control. Okay. Number 2 is to talk about like if they have a potentially valuable argument, right? You probably, as you are listening, you're like, this sounds pretty good. You perhaps worried, for example, if this comes from PM, you're worried that DPM might be able to extend this and, for example, really mechanize this. What you can do is to realize what's the most important thing that is said, because there's a potential that this becomes valuable in the round. So perhaps 1 rebuttal is fine, but deal with the foundation of the argument, right? If it's unclear, we will look into this sooner, but just understanding that you don't have to specifically like rebut every single thing that they say, right? Even if everything seems like a potential valuable argument, what you can do is to just think about what's the most important thing. What are they trying to prove? What can I prove to make sure that I'm able to mitigate as much of their benefit as possible? Okay, and the last thing is just like unpersuasive argument. And this is a lot, especially when teams hear for example, certain groundings, like certain examples, and you're kind of like triggered and you're like, oh, I need to rebut this. But in reality, this is actually an unpersuasive argument. So what you can do is just a simple counter premise is good enough. So these particular instances, you can probably just engage with this in your substantive. You can also just talk about how these are irrelevant and tell me a little bit why that's irrelevant, right? So you don't have to take so much of your time. Okay, right. Let's look at the next slide. So here are the examples in terms of understanding. So we're using a very, very simple motion on just how this house would ban guns. So perhaps the argument would be to talk about how guns basically lead to more gun-related deaths caused by violent people, for example, within public school shootings. So if we were to deconstruct this particular argument, the essence of this is to basically talk about like what you can get from your opponent is perhaps you will have on net, like I guess a lot of death because you have guns, right? The accessibility of guns then allows for these particular things, right? So in terms of how we are able to rebut or respond to this, three things, right? Number one, let's talk about why this is essentially not true. So when we look into the slide, it talks about how violent people who probably have criminal tendencies will still be able to find guns on the black market anyway, and they can still hurt others using other weapons, right? This is very intuitive, right? Perhaps if a form of violence were to happen, we understand and we realize that it's not just only going to be because of guns. So this is when you're able to somewhat mitigate a lot of the harms that they say, right? Because if it's true that the people that they are trying to characterize are insanely dangerous, they are very much malevolent in all instances, we think that these people are still able to exist and still have that form of access for guns. The difference is they probably would just get it on the black market. So Gov doesn't solve everything as well. Okay. B is to talk about why this argument is simply just not important, right? So anything can be harmful based on the intentions of its users. This is when you're also able to draw parallels with a lot of things that are actually harmful or dangerous that we have within status quo, but people still perhaps, like we still have it, it's still not banned, right? So guns are neutral, right? And it can be used for good in the hands of right people. So for example, we still need guns to stop criminals from causing hurt, right? We still need guns when it comes to like the military or the police or just the institutions that are there for our security, right? So this is when we're able to prove how guns was never going to be the like a most important like thing to ban, but rather making sure that the intentions of the users is something that we are able to, talk about in the debate. So it basically shifts the debate in a sense where the judge understands how opposition now is able to engage in perhaps what Gov has to offer. Okay. Number three is to look into the even ifs or the comparisons. And this one, I think a lot of teams probably do not have so much problem, right? I think a lot of you guys, I hope, are very much aware of this particular way to rebut, right? So for example, even if guns lead to more deaths, it is still essential to prevent deaths in cases of self-defense where there is a power imbalance, right? So often and not, when we talk about like shootings, for example, within the argument that like Gov, let's say this is Gov, okay, that Gov is pushing for example, public school shootings. The truth is that we agree that having guns perhaps leads to a lot of deaths just simply because how easy it is to just kill a person, right? But it's also essential for us then to prevent death in cases like, once again, where you require that gun for self-defense, right? Where you require it for your own like benefit. And so this is when you're able to do that even if. So as a judge, what we're able to see when speakers are able to do now the third or C in terms of the rebuttal is that number one, we understand that you agree like what government says to a certain extent is true. Number two, you are in a sense like shifting it to prove why like banning the guns was not the solution. Okay, right. Right, let's look into the first one. And this is when we're going to like really look into why, for example, like when you are trying to refute, this is not true. Okay, I'm also sorry for the like sound, if you can hear that background sound, yeah? So this rebuttal strategy is proving that your opponent's claim is untrue or basically unlikely to happen, right? So the root word, of course, if you look into it, is just like proving why it's not true, right? But if you can see within the like second part here is that it's unlikely to happen. Okay, so what you can do is you can start by identifying what's the backbone, right? What is contingent for this team to be able to prove what they're saying, right? What's the clincher of their premise, and break it down directly. So if we look into the example, which is this house would implement a quota for women in parliament, Gov's point would be to talk about how having a female quota will basically create more gender equal laws simply because there will be more women fighting and passing laws to protect women's rights. This is very intuitive, right? The lawmakers that we have are often men, right? And it's very obvious that Gov is probably going to talk about this. So this is something like if you were to get this motion, you are already able to think about the response that you probably would already have. This is a preemption, okay? But when we talk about doing this, the first way of rebutting, which is just to prove why it's not true, we can talk about how conservative ideologies still persist because many female MPs are also conservative as well. So being a female within a parliament, right, and this is very smart, doesn't necessarily like mean that you're going to have the most progressive laws or to a certain extent the most equal forms of laws because you are still unable to in a way be sure what's the political leanings of these particular MPs, right? That's why you talk about abortion bills, for example. So the majority rules in parliament, like female MPs end up being discriminated a lot more because quotas will hurt their credibility, right? And it's very intuitive. Like, you know, the reason why women are there aren't exactly because they are great and they are recognized, but rather as a tokenistic mechanism to just probably have them there, like a form of an affirmative action, right? So bills are about negotiating power. Anger male MPs, so you lose their cooperation, right? So you still, in a way, require having male MPs to somewhat cooperate with you. So what government is likely going to do is just anger them, and then you lose their cooperation, and they're the majority anyway, right? So this is really just like disproving that argument, like essentially, because if Gov says that you create more gender equal laws, then the first thing I would say is that that's very, very like, you know, optimistic of them to just agree that that's going to happen, right? The process into making sure that you will get those laws is the thing that you are saying. So what you're rebutting is the prerequisite to the benefit that they are saying, right? Because what you're saying is for as long as you don't know what's the like leanings of these particular MPs, it's unlikely that you're going to get these laws. And number two, it's unlikely then that you would get cooperation from the other MPs who are the majority anyway. So Gov cannot say that they're going to get like all these gender equal laws and say that you have nothing on your side. Okay, right. I hope that's clear. Now, number two is to basically flip or tip the scale against. Okay. This basically talks a lot about like how you're able to neutralize the point, because what it does is it will make you even with the other team. So as you know, debating doesn't necessarily mean that you are able to win all forms of issues and clashes, right? So there are times where like some of these particular clashes needs to be like a slightly tipped off scale, if that makes sense. Okay, so you're able to neutralize it, right? So when you add a rebuttal that switches the very nature of the point, what you do is you've tipped the scales against them. Okay, so you don't have to accept any harm that's proposed by the other team to be a harm. Does that make sense? Or a benefit to be a benefit. So I think this is very natural for a lot of debaters to already have a sense of questioning, right? So to tip the scales against them, point out that even if their point is true, it still benefits your team. Okay, so let's look at this. The same motion on how we're able to implement a quota for women in parliament, Gov would probably talk about how we need female quotas because only female MPs have a vested interest and or qualified to fight for women's rights. So what Gov is saying is that like we need these MPs because they're the ones who are going to do it. They're the ones who are the most qualified to do it. Okay. So the rebuttal here in terms of tipping the scale is to talk about how if we agree with what Gov says, this alienates men and tells them they don't have to fight for women's rights because Gov agrees that women are strong enough to be able to make these changes, right? It means that men do not feel the need to fight for it too now, and that's a problem, right? So what Op then talks about here is that the quota, what Op, for example, if you were to flip the sides in terms of opposition, is the quota will intensify resentment against women and lead to greater discrimination of female MPs, right? This is very similar to the previous slide we talked about in proving why the argument is not true. So the rebuttal here is to talk about how media depiction of discrimination, it sparks public outrage, and it provides the best reasoning as to why female quotas were necessary to begin with, right? So as you can see, what we're doing when we're trying to flip the scale, even if it's the slightest, is number one, to prove why we're still able to, I guess, have that. But number two, and most importantly, is that you're still able to talk about the harm that is likely going to happen, which means even if Gov gets their benefit, you tip it slightly by proving to the judge what's likely going to happen. Okay? I hope that makes a lot of sense. Now, let's talk about the third way in terms of responding, which is to prove why it's just not important. So this rebuttal goes a layer deeper. The reason being is because it will be able to discredit your opponent's point. So even if they were able to prove it to be true, okay? And I think this one is very, very popular, used by debaters, especially in top rooms, because think about it, right? If you are in a room that's very, very solid and competitive, it's unlikely that you will have teams that will just prove things that are just essentially untrue, right? Which means the likely rebuttal that you probably will be making is to tip the scale, or what we're seeing on slide, which is just why what they're saying is not going to be important. So debaters should be mindful to not use this as a standalone rebuttal in most circumstances, right? So you can't just say to the judge, this is not important, and therefore you proceed to your substantive. That is very, very unpersuasive. So if the adjudicator disagrees with your assessment of its importance, you might end up sounding dismissive of the point if you do not also neutralize the analysis that comes with it, right? So for example, a lot of teams fall into the trap of just saying judge, this is not important, or you're not giving a good expansion of your rebuttal, but you're just saying it's not important, and that's why you're skipping. So that's very, very hard for a lot of judges often to be able to understand why it's not important, especially if you don't tell them why it's not important. So the same thing, if we were to look at the example, we're still using the same motion. Gov would probably say the quota will anger the men and the conservatives in society, right? So the rebuttal here is to talk about how angering men is not as important as fighting for gender equality, right? Because all forms of gender equality will anger the conservative men anyways. Society has also become accepting of women's rights, so there wouldn't be such a strong backlash. This, if you notice, is quite similar to what you've learned in terms of framing, because you are able to characterize strategic things that are important and are essential to the debate. So if the biggest problem on Gov was to talk about anger, specifically to the conservatives, what you're able to do in proving why whatever Gov says is not important is because it's going to happen anyway, right? If these men were going to be conservatives anyway, then they would have been against any form of change for women regardless, right? So you're going to anger them anyway. Society, at least right now, and this is when you're able to characterize the most important context in the debate, which is that society now as well, they're very, very accepting of women's rights. If not to the fullest extent, but what I'm proving here is that there's still that particular progress and we are able to still continue having that form of projection. So what Gov says is not really important, is not really the biggest harm. Okay. Yep. Number 4, let's talk about how we're able to mitigate the arguments that are pushed upon us. So this rebuttal basically aims to underplay whatever harms or benefit that is being proposed by your opponent. So it doesn't remove the point altogether. So note about that, right? But it goes a long way to show that the situation is not as severe and therefore does not warrant their position on the topic. So this is very important. If you are wanting to mitigate, what you can do is you can do things like, number 1, proving how there are existing alternatives. Number 2, you can suggest additional check and balances. I'm well aware that you guys might be like kind of confused, like what are all these things? It's okay, I'll explain a bit. You can also show a trend of improvement, or you can recharacterize status quo altogether. But on top of my head, since we're talking about the one that is bolded like that, I just hope that you guys don't use your gadgets or chat GPT to be giving me all these statistics, or be giving any other judges these statistics. It just proves that perhaps you are not honest in the tournament. So this trend of improvement doesn't require you to cite Wikipedia or cite this form of article whatsoever. The trend of improvement here is just that you can basically, in your own words or by your own readings that you have done individually, talk about that. Okay, so on top of my head, before I forget, okay, I want to talk a little bit about suggesting additional checks and balances, right? So checks and balances, as you guys know, as the name suggests, is a form of way that you're able to get accountability. So perhaps the first mechanism doesn't work, you probably have the second mechanism. And often a lot of institutions, they have a lot of check and balances throughout the process, the bureaucracy, whatsoever, right? So you're always able to suggest that additional one. Okay, now let's look at the example here. This house would implement a quota similarly. So what Gov is probably going to talk about is how women are being underrepresented in politics, and they will not be elected into office without a quota. Wow. The rebuttal here is to talk about how progressive men can also represent women, right? So this is the reality. Okay, a lot of the progress that we have today doesn't necessarily mean that it was in all circumstances only fought by women. We have also been fought by like progressive men, or men who probably believe in our values as well, right? So it doesn't mean that you, in all instances, only need women to have this representation in politics. Perhaps visually, yes, but in terms of change, not necessarily, right? So the next thing is to talk about how women can get into parliament by their own merit. So for example, we have more women in parliament now in history, right? In Malaysia, but this is a bit old, but like the US, the first female presidential nominee, even for this year, we have Kamala Harris. All of these instances that you're able to show that trend of improvement, if that makes sense. Okay, so you don't have to read out from like an article. These are like knowledge that you probably already know. Now you just got to be able to ground it and execute it in a nice way to prove why you're able to mitigate a large chunk of the harms that are pushed upon you. Okay. Okay, last, I think, is on an even if comparison. So this one, I want to like really just I just really hope that you guys often are quite good in this, because this is one of the easiest, one of the most taught. I guess a lot of coaches as well, and a lot of of them basically teach the students to do the even if comparison. So this should ideally be the final level of rebuttal to prove holistically why things are still better off in your world and worse off in their world, right? This is practiced for even like whip speeches, right? The worst case scenario, the best case scenario, right? Sometimes people call that this is a form of weighing, right? But they're often just an even if, okay? So debaters, what you can do is you can suggest that even if everything that your opponent said is true and important. So this, let me just annotate to prove to explain to you what I'm talking about. This part, saying why it is true and important, is actually a form to prove to the judge that you are being a very charitable team. There are teams who are unwilling to engage in the best circumstances of their opponent. Sometimes you might get away with it, but most of the time that's very unstrategic, right? So yeah, you are able to kind of engage and talk about how even if whatever they said is true and important, on a balance, your world still has better principles and outcomes. Okay, so what you can do is you can compare the following versions of social change in the bigger picture. What do I mean by this? So for example, in government's world, women will immediately be represented in the legal system, and they can actively take part in the creation of laws that protect women. So there's a top-down change, right? So the change happens from the top, so the higher ups, and it goes down. It changes the whole hierarchy, right? So what OP can do in terms of rebutting what Gov has said is to talk about how it doesn't immediately change the perception of people on the ground, right? Laws don't receive support, right? If laws don't receive support, laws are not enforceable, right? You have the wage gap law. You guys can read this yourself as well, but this is what I'm able to tell you, where you're able to compare best case scenarios directly, right? Even if we do have these laws, it does not necessarily mean these laws are enforceable, right? So for example, you can have a lot of institutions or groups in terms of making like platforming women's problems, or talking about it whatsoever, but it doesn't necessarily mean women necessarily don't report that violation. The problem is that we don't often get that change that we want, right? So this is when you're able to compare and prove why Gov at the end of the day doesn't meet their end of goal when they say that they want gender equality. Okay, now let's look at Ops world. Long-term social change will be organic and genuine in creating a society that cooperates with the protection of women. So this is a bottom-up change, right? Which is to agree that you need to create societies first, and that will create change at the top. So what Gov can rebut in terms of pushing on Op is that we can't just wait for gender equality to be passed. It creates victims of circumstances that we could have protected in the meantime, right? Because that's something that Op needs to kind of agree. When you want to do this organic change, you basically agree that you probably have to wait, and it takes some time, right? So opposition's decision to wait for change is an active decision to discriminate women despite believing in gender equality, right? So using women in the present as a battering ram for future women. Okay, right. Okay, we're slowly about to end. So if you have any question, you can send it in now in terms of like specific ones so that you don't forget as well. Okay, so which part of the argument do I rebut? Right, this is a very, very important question. And this is something that I was able to flag out as well at the start of our lecture. So 4 things, and this is the most important one and the easiest way for you to be able to have a good execution when you are trying to do your responses. Number 1, you need to rebut the main premise in itself. So this is the argument that is contingent on that team winning, and so that's the one you take the most time in rebutting, right? Number 2, you want to be able to rebut the analytical links. Was there a clincher between that? Was the outcome that they said was going to be proven in terms of the process, the prerequisites before that outcome, right? Number 3, you can rebut the examples. Though I have to admit that sometimes teams get a little bit indulgent in terms of rebutting these examples, but rebutting examples as well makes it quite easy for your opponent to understand how you're navigating, for the judge to understand what you're trying to talk about. So rebutting examples as well sometimes actually benefits teams as well. Number 4, you also want to be able to rebut the importance of the argument, right? So this is something that I have personally. So what I like to do is, in terms of having an argument, I also explain why this argument is important, simply because I don't want to fall in this trap. But assuming your team doesn't explain why that particular argument is important or debate winning, if you are able to rebut the importance of the argument, that's very, very good as well, right? Because it proves that even if government took a long time to explain this, why this was never going to be the tipping point of the debate, why this was never going to be the reason why they win the debate. Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna give some time to just like you guys to read this. Okay, let's just look at what's bold here. So civil disobedience is a legitimate political tool in achieving social justice. Minorities do not have the political capital to sway their representatives. Public scrutiny, media coverage, and eventually acute political pressure. Rosa Parks' civil disobedience, key civil rights movements, activists like Martin Luther King. Okay, so when you're trying to rebut the premise, is when you talk about how civil disobedience is a legitimate tool for social change. Okay, so that's the premise. That's your argument, right? When you want to rebut an analysis, this is it, which is to rebut the minorities don't have the capital for social change. So you can just rebut that and say that even if they don't have the capital for social change, there are like other means. This is when you're able to prove the alternatives that they're also able to opt into, right? When you're talking about rebutting examples specifically, the examples given by this team, aka this paragraph, we have MLK, we have Rosa Parks, right? So these are the examples that you were also able to rebut. And lastly, in terms of rebutting the importance, which is how this will actually create social change, right? So does it create that social change? Why is social change the most important thing? How do you have social change in your side? Okay, right. Yeah, similarly, same thing. Okay. So let's go through this quickly. In terms of rebutting the premise, we can talk about how the ends don't justify the means, right? Violent actions aren't exactly legitimate. Okay, so if opposition can show viable alternatives for democratic engagement, then Gov's premise fails, right? Because you hurt more Black protesters when you use them as a battering ram. When you are trying to rebut the analysis of minorities don't have the capital for social change, you can talk about how you can still gain the attention of the majority, right? This is you proving that there is an alternative for these minorities to opt in. So in terms of the next one is whether is it going to be slow or not. Often being slow also equates to failure. Sometimes it doesn't equate to failure. So being able to point these instances out is how you're also able to rebut such analysis, right? In terms of rebutting the examples, like MLK and Rosa Parks, they are examples of peaceful protests. They are not violent protests, right? So similarly, you can talk about how modern contexts render these examples inapplicable. So you can say to the team, you can't use these like individuals as your example and hope to win because the context currently doesn't necessarily make it applicable. Okay, so you are also mitigating, you're also proving why these examples are not important. Lastly, in terms of rebutting the importance, if they're talking about how this will create a social change, right? So the idea here is to kind of talk about how you still have the media cater to the majority norms where stereotypes unfortunately still prevail, right? The idea of being dangerous if you are colored whatsoever. So changing the law via blackmailing the state is meaningless. Only change via democratic engagement is meaningful. And that's something that you perhaps have on your side. Okay. Yep, I think that is the last slide. Do you guys have any question that you would like to ask? Okay. Okay, just answering the question just now about how long do we have for rebuttals, right? Like I said, and I'm reminding again, it really depends. Number one, it depends on the round that you are in, right? Sometimes you have, assuming you are LO and the PM perhaps the case is very simple that you think you can deconstruct in a minute or two, then it's a minute or two. Sometimes you are sometimes you're like the whip or the deputy, where you have actually a lot of things to talk about, but you also have a lot of substantives to also talk about, then that means you have to be a lot more diligent in looking at the timer in terms of like making sure that you are responding to the most important things. And the thing here, right, guys, in terms of rebuttal, which is also important but isn't included in the slide, is debating is a team sport. The stuff that you aren't able to rebut or respond, you have your teammates to also do that. But it doesn't mean that you don't have to rebut anything, right? It just means that you need to do it strategically and efficiently. Stuff that you cannot rebut, you can tell your partner to rebut. Okay? Can we rebut the rebuttal that had been rebutted by the, sorry, that's like, can we rebut the rebuttal that had been rebutted by the op? Oh, whose rebuttal is this? So you want to rebut? Okay, that's kind of complicated. Okay, but the gist here is yes, because a form of like response or rebuttal here is just to kind of clarify what you mean, right? Like that's the reason why often rebuttals, they are encouraged to be at the top of your speech. So if you think something that they themselves have rebutted, but you think that you want to rebut it again, like the response that they have given to your case, then by all means rebut. That just means that it's a clarification. Often teams just make it as a clarification. This is what we mean, right? And then get into your rebuttals. Is rebutting compulsory? I personally think, if like as a debater, I think it is very compulsory, right? But like if you're prime minister, then no, rebutting is not compulsory for you. That's when you have preemptions in terms of engagement, right? You're already thinking what your opponent would be talking about, and that's how you engage with it in your speech in itself. So it's low-key like a rebuttal, but it isn't a rebuttal. But I would really encourage having rebuttals, guys. Like a lot of times, if the round is super duper close, like responses are very important for the judge to be able to weigh the debate. Okay, no worries, Audrey. It wasn't weird. This is a bit hard to understand. Do I need to apply all 5 of the categories to my rebuttals, or is it better to apply some? No, you don't have to apply all 5. That's crazy if you apply all 5. So what we can do is, I'm pretty sure you guys can watch this recording again, and I'm pretty sure hopefully we probably would release the slides. I'm not sure about that, but you're still able to see this video, right? So what you can do here is kind of, I guess, talk to yourself. Which type of like style is the one that resonates the most to you? Like if you like to just prove why it's not true, then go ahead, right? If you think doing an even if is better, but like now you've understood how to do it, you just want to like sharpen it and make sure it's better, then by all means do that. So you don't need all 5. Sometimes you can do 2 of them. That's also strategic. How many rounds of debate are there? This is not a part of this lecture, okay? How do we know which type of rebuttal to do? It really depends, right? Some motions are very like, some motions you can think of the responses already slightly, right? So you can already know like, oh, if they say this, I already know how to respond to that. So that's how you kind of know which type of rebuttal to do before you enter the room. And number 2, sometimes it really just depends on your opponent's case. They might have a very solid case, but they don't prove it well enough. If they don't prove it well enough, that's when you do the rebuttals. For example, why it's not true, why it's not important whatsoever. Can I rebut in the middle of my speech? Yes, you can. In fact, this is when I say you perhaps do a rebuttal at the start. You can already allocate some time there. But in terms of these little, like small little things that your opponent says that you want to engage in your speech, if you think your substantive already has the weighing and like the comparisons with your opponent, then by all means just let the judge know that you will be engaging with it in your substantive, right? Yeah, and then just flag it out. Remember to flag it out. Don't just like, expect the judge to remember. Also talk about how like, hey judge, this is how I'm engaging with what Gov has said. Does POI influence the debate? How many should we take? Okay, this isn't that, like related, but I'm going to answer it like just very short. Yes, it does. In fact, in a lot of debates, it makes the debate a lot more engaging. Okay, what should we do? We can't answer POIs. Try your very best to answer. That's what I would encourage. If you really can't, just be confident, right? I'm pretty sure everyone here You guys are really smart. So by all means, I'm pretty sure you will know how to give an answer. You can give a simple answer for sure. Yes, no. You can, you can just say like, I'll engage with this in my substantive. Just try your very best to be as confident as possible and as calm as possible. Okay, last 1 minute. Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Okay, one more. What happens if I'm not able to rebut my opponent? What should I do? Steve, is this because you don't know of the rebuttal? Because, okay, two ways. Number one, if you really don't know what to rebut, please just try to mitigate it, right? So try your very best to kind of say, it's okay, even if there's a problem, why you still have your benefit, right? That means you have to be heavier on your substantives and the material that you are bringing in so that you hope that the judge will weigh that a lot more important than your responses. But if you can't rebut because your case is perhaps like, it just means that your case isn't directly engaging with your opponent, not gonna lie, because if it directly engages, that means there are clashes. That means you are able to still rebut. Can I see if I'm unable to rebut in my turn? Can I say that I'll pass it on? I mean, you can say it. Like a lot of teams, school debaters, I know they do it. That's by preference, I would say. If you don't want to say it, it's totally fine as well. Yeah. Any question? Is it required to rebut in speech, or we can choose to rebut? Like I said, I would really encourage you guys to do your rebuttals. Even if it's short, make sure you do your rebuttals. Yep, I won't be taking any questions anymore. Okay, last one, because I think it's pretty good. In rebutting winning arguments, what does multiple layers of rebuttals refer to? Multiple layers of rebuttals here basically means like you giving, like the easiest way to explain it to you guys is that you're giving multiple reasons how you take down that premise. So if the premise was to talk about how you get more gender equality laws and bills, tell the judge here are 3 reasons why they are unlikely to get it, right? So that's a form of like 3 layers. Now you can also say here are 3 levels of analysis as to why they won't get gender equality laws, and explain. For example, number 1, we are unsure of the women like political standings for these MPs, which means it's unlikely for it to be feasible, like stuff like that. Okay, so you are expanding it. The same thing you do for your argument, you're also doing it here. Okay, this is a bit scary. Don't give generic made-up situation, please. I think it's better if you give actual real-life incidents. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I wish you guys the best of luck for tomorrow and the weekend.